Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Soon your station will be here, and through the door of my compartment the conductor announced, 10 minutes to go. Thank you, my good man. I picked up my valise and down the narrow corridor. While reading, sitting on the joints of the rails of the carriage, headed for the exit. The train slowed down. It jerked several times and finally, shrilly, with the wheels locking, came to a stop. The conductor wiped the handrails and helped me down the steep steps to the platform. The steam locomotive blew its whistle and the train shuddered. As you sang, an optical seizure began to slowly gain speed. Soon the last carriage disappeared around the corner. The clatter of the wheels ceased to be heard, and there was silence. I looked around. A small station, or rather, a half station, a wooden, in some places rotten platform, and a forest all around. I took out my watch and opened the lid. A quiet tune played. The time had long since passed 12 o'clock, and it was appropriate to think that evening would soon be upon us. I headed towards a small structure. Apparently, the station keeper's cabin. The door was locked. Everything about it said that trains rarely stopped here, and that the station master's position had long since been abolished for lack of use. I looked around, still not a soul in sight. To be honest, I felt a little creepy to be alone in an unfamiliar place. It was a rather dubious pleasure on the eve of evening. I walked around the cabin and saw an old inn going into the woods. Is there nothing to do? We must go. According to my calculations, the homestead should be somewhere about 5 kilometers from the railroad. After all, I have a revolver with me, and I'm not afraid of the nocturnal evil. I crossed myself and headed confidently toward the road, hitting the railroad embankment before heading deep into the woods. I stopped and pulled the revolver out of my valise, cranked the drum, checking the cartridges, and slipped the weapon behind my belt under my jacket. Well, can we go now? The inn was old, and it was obvious that it was rarely used. To the right and left grew tall mossy, spruce trees with their paws. There were pine trees all the way to the ground, but mostly I was surrounded by melnick. Elderberry bushes grew along the roadside, covered with bright red full berries. For some reason I remembered how as boys we used to spit unripe green berries through tubes, getting unimaginable pleasure from it. I imagined myself now with a buzina in my mouth, and it made me laugh. The road was mostly dry, but somewhere there were puddles, in some places quite large and deep. Sometimes there were boulders, brought here by the Olenek. They were neatly placed on the roadside, so as not to interfere with the passage. I looked under my feet for signs of hoofprints and wheels. There was no cart in sight. I walked not fast, swaying my valise in time with the movement of the evening. The sun was slowly but inevitably retreating behind the trees. The pace was getting darker and there was no end of the road in sight. I began to look around for a place to stay for the night. I was born into a poor family. My parents were once serfs of the Vyazemsky princes. My mother was brought up by the Baron and was brought up in the best noble traditions. In time, the Baron himself laid his eyes on her. But his wife was vigilant, and as soon as she saw his sympathy, immediately sold my future mother to a neighbor, and the latter married her to his coachman Kevin. And that's how my mother became Marlo Slaw. Being a woman of purpose and firm character, she managed to re-educate her husband, my father, taught him literacy, and made him study. After liberation, my father engaged in selling hemp and pine resin for his wife's dowry. And with his savings he leased a large plot of forest, which once belonged to the same princes Vyazemsky. Gradually the trade began to bear fruit. My father became a millionaire and owned several cargo steamships on the Dnieper. We had a big house outside the city and a large apartment in Street Petersburg. I was the only child in the family, and my mother, a former serf, prepared me for university. But I wanted to be in the military. By that time, the rules for entering a military school had been liberalized, and they started accepting non-oblomen. My father paid the right people, and for 2.5 years I became a junker at the Vilna Cavalry School. After graduation, I was sent in the rank of lieutenant to the Smith Hussar Regiment, which was going to the Caucasus. Well, in fact, do not send to war scion of a noble family, such served only in the Guards. In the first battle at the storming of the fortified Al-Zaitaq, I was wounded. I spent a long time in the hospital until I was dismissed from the army. But I had no sooner returned home, as I was summoned to one institution and offered to serve as an official. I must say that the new service did not interfere at all with my commercial activities. By the time I returned from the army, the Vyazemsky princes were completely impoverished. The baron's son Christopher started to trade, but quickly went bankrupt and mortgaged even the estate. His sister Lisa sat in her father's estate and, it seems, was preparing to become an old diva. There were no hunters for the young lady. Our house was not far from the prince's nest, and one evening, returning from hunting, I happened to see the young princess. I saw her and fell in love. I didn't chew the snot for a long time. A month later, I sent the matchmakers. You should have seen the old baron and his son. They seemed to burst with anger, if only a former slave, to marry their daughter. The blue blood even boiled. I was about to be chased away, but my father politely explained to the food gentleman that he would give a course to their bills of exchange, and if they did not pay their debts, the estate would come to me. This is a matter for zealous princes. The end of the debate was put by the princess. She, paying no attention to the relatives, gave her consent to marry me, knowing perfectly well that she was losing her title and nobility. A month later, we were married in a small church. A month later, I took my young wife and left for the capital of the empire. Now, allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen. I'm a salesman of all kinds of collections. Yes, that's my specialty. You might also call me an antiques dealer, but that's a bit of a stretch. I search for, buy out collections that have already been collected by someone, and then sell them to amateurs. Expertise, evaluation is all mine. Understandably, I try to buy cheaper and sell more expensive. The difference is my income, but I always try to give a real price. Cheating is not my thing. Collections, any postcards, paintings, watches antique and not antique bronze, cast iron, musical instruments, bells, anything a person can be passionate about and collect. Believe me, there are some very unusual collections. For example, a collection of feathers. It would seem a trifle. What could be interesting in it? Not at all. I recently sold such a collection to a St. Petersburg object for very decent money. Or, for example, a collection of ships' helms and bells. I bought it from the widow of an old captain and sold it very profitably to a collector. He even almost fainted from happiness, so the money was not spared. I'm not talking about the gun collection. It's a gold mine, but I don't collect them myself. For me, it's only a trade item to be in the subject. I have to read scientific books and magazines, understand the types of iron casting, know the composition of ancient enamels and paints, be able to distinguish the original from the fake, sometimes very skillful. Some sellers go to all sorts of tricks and stratagems to sell their things more expensive, so you have to keep your eyes open. That night was no different from any other. Summer was fading, but it was still quite warm. Soon the cottagers would be back in town from their vacation, and my trade would be revitalized. I sat in front of the fireplace and smoked a cigar. I was leafing through a recent catalog from a Leipzig auction. As a rule, nothing of interest came up at these auctions, so a couple or three old canvases by unknown artists, some porcelain, and a covered green damsel, bronze. Complete collections of the subject of my commercial interest rarely pop up at these kinds of auctions. But this time I was interested in a small selection of jewelry, a few rings, necklaces, a couple of bracelets, white gold, and precious stones. In general, I do not like to fight at an auction, raising the bid to infinity. Generally, things are auctioned off to maximize profit. I don't know why I paid attention to the jeweler. I put aside the catalog and took the Jeller's Handbook off the shelf. On antique jewelry and articles is very often found branding with the assay. an ancient Russian measure of weight equal to 1/6 of a pound. The gold or silver content of an alloy is determined by the amount of Zlotnikov maximum 96. For example, 50. A 6 gold assay means that there are 56 parts of gold and 96 parts of the alloy. The remaining 40 additives, the so-called literature. Thus, pure metal without any impurities corresponded to 96 gold pieces of gold, 24 carats. It should be said that the presence of gold in the alloy forms the price of the product, plus the work of the craftsman and so on. It's a bit boring, of course, but agree, valuable information, and for lovers of antiques, and for specialists. So all the products presented in the catalog were 92 OU sample, which in itself was unusual. Budget jeweler is usually not higher. The 56th grading had salt in the fireplace at night, and soon I dozed off with a book dropped in my lap. I dreamed of the goldsmith, new samples, and a roundel round my head. I was awakened by a knock at the door. On the threshold stood a rather decently dressed gentleman with an expensive English cane hanging from the curve of his left arm. The man inclined his head politely and asked if I could see Mr. Marlowe. "What can I do for you?" I replied politely. "We could talk." The man nodded toward the open door. "If you mean business, I don't do business at home. Come by the store tomorrow." I was about to close the door, but the man stopped it with the toe of his lacquered shoe. "Believe me, Mr. Marlowe, what I'm about to tell you will interest you." The man looked me straight in the face, and there was something in his eyes that made me shy away. Letting him into the apartment, we went into the hall, and I nodded to the visitor on a vacant chair. "Would you like a cognac or a cigar?" I tried my best to hide my irritation. "Thank you. Let's get down to business." The stranger sat down in the chair, leaning against its arm. "Allow me to introduce myself. Sam Mr. Marlowe. I collect unusual sculptures. The means allow me to do so. They're not made of porcelain or metal. The object of my passion is human figures made of other materials, wax. For example, only wax can fully convey the beauty of the human body. All the more so now wax figures are becoming fashionable. But alas, wax figures do not last long. Even a simple change in air temperature can, if not destroy the figure, but to cause its noticeable damage. That's not the case with wood. Wooden sculptures can only be destroyed by fire, and if a wooden sculpture is properly treated, it can last forever. The stranger's eyes gleamed, reflecting the fire of the fireplace. "Do you want to sell me your collection?" I asked, blowing smoke out of my mouth. "No, I want to offer you to find something for me." "What do you mean?" My question sounded a little uncertain. "I want to ask you to visit Mr. Williams, or rather his estate. The fact is, the owner of the manor died recently, but I have information that he had a large collection of sculptures. There's no mention of it after his death, but it can't have just disappeared. You have to find it. I'll pay you good money." I could hear the excitement in the guest's voice. He was about to say something else. Lisa, my wife and assistant, entered the room. "Sorry, darling. I didn't know you were busy." She smiled sweetly. "Maybe bring an appetizer." Lisa nodded at the decanter of brandy. I looked questioningly at my guest. He smiled and shook his head negatively. "Thank you, dear. We'll be done soon." I did not introduce the guest to my wife. Lisa tilted her head, letting me know that she understood me, and quickly left the living room. "Where do you think this manor is located?" I returned to the conversation. "And what makes you think the collection still exists?" "I don't. I know. I was in Switzerland recently and saw a little girl's figure carved out of wood. It's from the Russian's collection. He was the only one who had figures like this. He showed me some in his St. Petersburg apartment. So you two know each other." I put the smoking cigar butt in the crystal ashtray. "Yes, casually. We crossed paths at an auction in Berlin. A year ago, he recognized me as a fellow countryman and invited me to visit his apartment in St. Petersburg. I took him up on that offer and stopped by. I fell in love with his collection. According to him, the main part of the collection is in his estate. It's about 100 kilometers along the Northwest Railroad. The manor is also called Elnik. The guest was rubbing his hands together with excitement. He asked the Russian if there were any hairs left or not. I took out a notebook. I don't know. According to him, he had a sister. She was living in this estate at the time. According to the Russian, she's a little out of sorts, shuns people, and doesn't like to socialize with them. She is a recluse. She is most likely the primary heir. We need to find the manor, check if there is a collection there, and persuade the sister to sell it. You can set the price. I'll do anything. The man was even freezing in his chair from excitement. In front of me lay the ancient city of Casimir, dissolved in the haze, or rather, what was left of it. I walked north for almost half a day through this ancient land. High hills sometimes, and dense forest now breathed. We know. I stood at the top of the tower and looked out at the thick new thickets outlining the tower and the ruins of the ancient city. In the distance, almost at the very horizon, I could see multicolored strips of already compressed fields, rye and wheat, orphaned by the wide stream leisurely carrying its waters. I cautiously descended to the ground and walked on a road not traveled in a long time. The day was coming to an end, and the heat was slowly beginning to subside in the grass. The grasshoppers awoke, and soon the air was filled with their cheerful rolling. Behind me I heard the squeak of wheels, and the whole not a horse. A cart surrounded by fresh hay was catching up with me. On the front sat a man overgrown, bearded to the ears, and lazily drove the horse to the oar, and carried a sledgehammer. "Is it something in a language I don't know?" he asked. I shrugged my shoulders, showing that I didn't understand anything. The man scratched his head, and after a bit of silence, said in pure Russian language, "Traveling baron." "You can say so," I replied with interest, looking at the raven of local places, looking for the estate of Mr. Russian. "There is one. It's about 20 versts away. You won't get there by nightfall. You'll have to spend the night somewhere." The man looked at me strangely. "Are you a baptized cross-bearer yourself?" "Of course I'm baptized." I pulled out a silver cross on a leather lace from under my shirt. "That's good. These places aren't well-to-do. It's better not to go at night." The charioteer crossed himself with some unfamiliar sign of the cross. "Where can we sleep here?" I asked. "Is there an inn nearby, do you think?" "Just by Perrin's ferry crossing. The Armenians crossed the river during the party. It's not far from there." The man grinned. "Sit down, sir. What's the use of beating your legs for nothing?" He fucked Jamma, and the horse trotted off. We passed the ruins of the city, and the road looped between the hills again. We rode in silence. The charioteer knew what he wanted and silently smoked a duck and an assad. I leaned back on the soft, fragrant hay and dozed off to the sound of the wheels. I woke up when the wheels stopped beating. The cart stood in front of a wide rubrail of ship's pine from the battle. Here was the charioteer squirming. He smiled broadly and waved his hand as if inviting me in. I got off the carts and the lull of the legs, and with interest began to look at the unusual shapes of the house, more like an ancient terem. I looked back at the massive iron-striped gate under a high frame. Just in front of them stood an ancient copper cannon aimed at the steamer. Strange. For what purpose? Inside we were greeted by a white, red-cheeked, and full of piles hostess. Smelled of hot samovar and bread. "Who is it you've brought?" "Charles." She smiled with a full mouth, scrutinizing me with a supple look. "Yes, here is the Baron of the Russian manor looking for him. He won't get there before dark, so accept a stay until morning." I inclined my head politely. "Come in, sir." The hostess's voice became viscously sweet, like overripe honey. I looked around. There were several tables in the hall. 3 men in the corner were drinking tea from a samovar with 3 pieces of sugar. Over the table hung a lively chatter in an unfamiliar language. They paid not the slightest attention to me. I sat down at a table covered with snow-white tablecloth, nodded to my traveling companion. "I invite you to join the company." My companion, while with pleasure, took off the con mascara and nestled it on a nail hammered into the wall, and went to the counter to order tea and snacks for the table. It was almost dark, and kerosene lamps were burning in the hall, creating a mysterious twilight, chipped with shadows. Above our table, too, the kerosene lamp was lit, shining in the shui with a flower as round as a large margarita afire. Soon the hostess brought a tall white teapot and 2 coolly perky Seraphan cups. Next on the wheat table, somehow by magic, there was a stock and a decanter. While about something, I looked around the room. The walls of the hall, at first glance, seemed to me extensive oak panels. But then I saw that they were perfectly matched pine logs. They were waxed and had a special amber color. Judging by the quality of the woodwork, it had been done skillfully and lovingly for centuries. I imagined for a second how much time and effort such quality work took. Right in front of me on the wall hung several ancient wooden shields with iron booms and leather plates. Most of them were covered with red and black paint already rubbed off. Between the shields on the carpets hung large and small axes, swords, muzzles, ancient daggers, and outlandish knives. Oh, and God knows what else. The soft thief of carpets emphasized the elegance of forms and the hidden strength of fatigue. All this household, despite its antiquity, was well cleaned and oiled. What struck me as a lover of antiquities was the excellent cachet of all these rarities. It seemed that swords, axes, had only yesterday been plucked out by the smith of the armorers. On the adjoining wall hung several unusual musical instruments, some very similar to guitar, others of exotic appearance, not like violins or some kind of snags with strings and bounces. A couple of bear skins and a few antlers weighed in. All in all, it all gave the hall an old cozy look. I even felt like I was somewhere in the 9th century instead of the last 1915. While I was looking around the room, on the table, on the tray was already lying minced meat and even duck covered with forbidden apples, dumping night jam nearby on a variety of plates and spoons. Salted mushrooms by the gun with garlic, boiled potatoes, and pate were frolicking. Almost transparent slices of ham were served separately. Wild boar, well smoked and cross-cut. As soon as Charles was seated at my table, the hostess brought out a dispersed charcuterie on a tray, in a large pewter shot glass, splashing some creepy liquid with the aroma of mint and something unfamiliar. "Try it, Baron," Charles smiled. "You've never had this before." I followed him and put the shot glass in my mouth. The liquid burned my gut for a moment and was quickly confused by the elderly. Tears splashed from my eyes, but I restrained myself and did not blush. But as the hostess looked at me with curiosity, what is it only I could pronounce, translating the spirit brewed by an ancient recipe only for dear guests, the hostess nodded at the birch sap of 100 herbs, and the dishes kept arriving. On the table appeared clay, potted with pickled moose, lips in under vinegar, my large wooden bowl of sauerkraut and pickles. Finally, the hostess personally placed a tin bowl on the table on which thinly sliced pieces of pie lay in a neat mound, made by mega important cookie brains. Charles filled the cooling shot glasses with vodka and proclaimed a toast. To be good to the court and alive for good luck. I didn't understand everything in this toast, but I dutifully drank. We had a snack, and Charles took out a tape about a raven, twisted a gypsy, and bought from a lamp. Satisfied, let out a line of smoke. "And what is it alive?" "As if, by the way," I asked. "You'll soon see for yourself," Charles grinned. We had been sitting for more than an hour when an old wolfish man with no arms entered the hall. Having signed a little at the entrance, he took down from the wall an instrument remotely resembling a violin. Soon a loud melody floated through the hall. It was unlike anything I'd heard before. Ragged rips, notes, squeaks, clouds, a sound that penetrated all the way to the heart. The music seemed like aliens from another world, of a world where non-humans ruled the ball. The melody lashed across the floor, then went up under the roof, striving to break free. Finally, it succeeded, and it soared into the starry sky straight to the golden chariot, the serpent, the god, the foot that began its flight into the coming dawn. The ancient music, played in these parts for 1,000 years, awakened vague and unfamiliar images in my mind that I had not suspected an hour ago. The hostess brought out a large wooden bowl and poured milk. The old man stopped playing and quietly tapped the floor with his staff. Knock, 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 knock. He stood for a while and knocked again. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of some movement from the dark corners of the plate. Snakes slowly crawled to the plate in unmanned shadows. I shuddered involuntarily. The very sight of creeping of warring creatures gave me a primal terror. I was about to rush to the exit, but he intercepted me by the arm. I froze and, afraid to move, stared at the tangle of snakes near the plate of milk. Suddenly, I felt something cold and slippery crawling up my leg. The head of a snake appeared above the table. It froze motionless as if taking in, occasionally showing its twin tongues, then crawled onto my lap and then onto the table. It grabbed from my plate a piece of meat and immediately swallowed. Now everyone in the room, or our table. The snake looked at me for some time with a non-running look, and then also leisurely descended to the floor on my leg and crawled to the plate. About 20 minutes passed, and the snakes slowly began to spread to the corners. People started talking in the hall again, and servants started running around. I sat in shock, unable to say a word. At last he managed to pour a shot of vodka into my mouth. He seemed to be frightened and surprised himself when we more or less came to our senses. My traveling companion said, "I have lived a long time, but this is the first time I have seen such a thing." Charles shook his head at the idea of the living embracing a man. Suddenly the old man, still standing at the entrance, looked in our direction. "To my head here alive. And to whom are they feet?" he said in a suddenly thick bass, tapped his staff, and walked out the door. What did he say? I looked at my neighbor. "The Serpentine was born tonight," the king said Charles fearfully, and looked at his mistress with a long, expressive look. It was already night outside the window. When I stood in the gate, there was a knocking in the courtyard. Well, knocked. That's a weak word. In the gate nails or something heavy, with Hilda's throat open loudly. Even from where I was standing, I could see the landlady turn pale and shudder. She nodded, and one of her servants ran to open the gate. A moment later, the stomping of horses' hooves sounded in the courtyard, and several men came in through the swinging doors, though it was not cold outside. They were dressed in cloaks made of wolf skins, wool on the outside. No weapons in sight, but long daggers were guessed under the squares. I knew that for local men a dagger is a mandatory attribute as a stone in the Caucasus. The newly arrived threw off their clothes and their arms under the running servants and sat down rankly at the free table on the benches. The hostess and the servants bustled around, arranging the utensils and dishes on the table. Soon the wine was sick in the parks, and the voices of the guests became louder. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the few visitors leaving the hall. Charles, too, disappeared as if vaporized. I, on the other hand, remained at my table. We ate the pie with pleasure and occasionally had a shot of vodka. Soon, I and later guests were left in the hall. The doors banged again, and a young lady entered the room. Her appearance was greeted with loud squawks. "Cindy, what's taking you so long?" They shouted for the hops and the young men. "Come and sit down with us." They quickly made room for their guest and moved her a wine glass. The maiden drained it in one fell swoop and looked curiously in my direction. I tried to ignore the merry company. I looked for my mistress with my eyes. "Going to go to bed?" "Pan missus," sounded a melodious voice right above my ear. I looked up. Opposite my table stood a long-time maiden and smiled. "May I have a glass of wine with you?" She unceremoniously sat down on the bench. Across from me emerged from the darkness. The servant served her a full glass of red wine. I poured myself some vodka. The girl barely touched my shot glass with her glass and leisurely drained it to the bottom. I drank a little and put the shot glass on the table. Pan is squeamish about drinking with me, quite loudly, unhappily said the maiden. He took me for a slutty girl. I already knew where this was going, and threw a quick glance at the opposite wall. Then I moved my valise toward me and opened it. My revolver was on the top of it, and it was a matter of seconds to get it out quickly. The room grew quiet. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement at a neighboring table and heard heavy footsteps. Raven, that insolent, insulted me with a nasty voice, spelled the girl, hiding behind the broad back of her defender. Pan knows what awaits him for insulting a lady. The scowling man spoke in a thick bass, putting his right hand on the hilt of his dagger. I involuntarily noticed the rings, thickly applied to his fingers. Provincial ponce. I stand up. Please forgive me if I have unwittingly offended you and yours. I've been here a long time, and I've had enough to drink. With your permission, I'm going to bed. I tried to speak peacefully, though I knew from experience that it would do little good in my situation. Mr. Nobleman. The man spoke again. No, I smirked. That makes things easier. Now, I'll teach you how to talk to a lady. You're an asshole. Then he threw back the floor of his green lightweight captain's jacket and pulled out a whip from behind his girdle. I was still trying to dodge the contraction by appealing to the voice of reason, but in vain. The presence of an infantile Menka and Hop in my head were doing their job. Pans decided to make fun of a stranger, to dispel, so to speak, boredom. Well done. He swung, going to hit me in the face with the whip, but I took a step to the side and shoved the offender with the palm of my hand. He couldn't stay on his feet and fell on his ass. The girl kicked out of the table and two men came up and rushed toward me. But I was already pulling a sword with a ravenous, narrow blade from the wall. I didn't dance or make glamorous paw with my sword. I just rushed in front of the two men who were running towards me and struck one of them in the face with the blade. He stumbled and fell to the floor. I met the other with a blow of my right hand, holding the hilt, and I could hear the bones of his nose cracking. On my left, a small man with a weighty club in his hand rushed at me. I didn't like to start with him. Lunged and punctured his arm. He howled and was no longer interested in me. Meanwhile, the maiden who had been lying continuously all this time helped the first one out of the door. That one snatched up a long dagger and, putting forward his right hand, rushed at me. I was busy with the servant and missed the moment. "Look out!" my mistress shouted to me, and I had time to turn around with a swift swing of my sword. The dagger fell from my assailant's hand, and then I was out of the way. A right straight punch to the jaw knocked the guy to the ground. I kicked him a few times, trying with the toe of my boot to mess up his face. If on the Grandee's Pawnee no longer ran, she sat silently, hammered in a corner, and watched the bloody fight with fear. Finally, the brawlers calmed down. 3 bodies lay motionless on the floor. The very first one was slightly underfoot. A servant sat by the column, clasping his bleeding hand with his hand. I stood motionless, holding the hilt of the sword in my palm. The light of the oil lamp reflected on its tip, gleaming predatorily. For a second, it seemed to me that death itself was dancing on my knee. Unforgiving and ruthless on the battlefield remained behind me. Thank you, Monsieur Lefort, for the lesson. Old Norman wrestling. That was very helpful. Not for nothing did I devote so much time to it at the Junkers School. Good blade, I said respectfully, and wiped the blade. And the white shirt to the servant then returned the weapon to its place. I turned to the hostess. She understood me without words and herself filled my glass with elm. I tipped the scalding drink into my mouth and picked up my valise. Carefully I stepped over the pans that had fallen silent on the floor. Show me to my room. I turned to the landlady. She took the kerosene, a new lamp, and without saying anything went to the stairs leading to the second floor. The day began, as usual, with an all-consuming boredom. Putting on a robe after a nap. Lisa had a cup of coffee in the dining room. At that time, the clock struck 12. It was time to get ready for lunch. Lisa yawned and with a bronze knife began to cut up the fancy French magazine delivered the night before. But no sooner had she cut the first page than the doorbell rang. A minute later, she was told that her brother Christopher and his companion had arrived. Without knowing why, Lisa was delighted at her brother's unexpected visit, especially with a mate after marrying Stephen. Brother and sister did not see each other often. Christopher avoided her husband in every way possible, considering it beneath his dignity to consort with some old box, especially since Stephen was not a nobleman and was clearly not fit for husband's Bukvayazemskaya. After the wedding, Lisa moved with her husband to the capital in his apartment. She felt that Stephen loved her. He pampered her in every possible way, bought expensive jewelry, dressed in the latest fashion, took her to theaters and galleries. Everything was fine at first sight, but it was only at first sight. Lisa caught on herself sympathetic, contemptuous looks of others. How could she, a born princess, sacrifice her nobility and title for the sake of her husband? Raznochensi, former serf. Not that it hurt her much, but still one had to admit it was unpleasant. And most of all, boredom. She didn't know what to do. She was going to study, but then she changed her mind. Lisa was educated. Her background gave her certain advantages. She had even graduated from the Smolny Institute, but it was difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to find a use for her talents in the empire. True, there was a way to give birth to Stephen children and take care of them. But something kept Lisa from taking that step, as if she were not quite finished. Surely she and Stephen would live together until they were old. Stephen had been gone for almost a week now, and Lisa did not know when her husband would return. She looked longingly at her watch and sighed heavily. Just then Christopher entered the living room. He was accompanied by a dapper young man dressed in a gray tee with a mustache. He was of the type that ladies like so much. Lisa noticed this at once and smiled to herself. "Hello, my soul." Christopher kissed his sister on the cheek. "Let me introduce you to my old friend Sebastian. He returned from London yesterday and is full of impressions. Sebastian, this is my sister Lisa." Christopher tilted his head. Sebastian took Lisa's outstretched palm with cold fingers and touched it lightly with his lips. "Where's your miser? Grandmother?" "All with the old man." Christopher's voice was full of contempt. "Christopher, please." Lisa looked at her brother reproachfully. "Stephen has been away on business for a week." "That's fine. Sebastian invites us to the Mikhailovsky Theater. The French are doing Traviata tonight. But then to the Metropole restaurant. Sophia is singing there tonight with a gypsy corps. It's wonderful. It's so good. And then there will be some exotic dances only for our own people." The maid came in and began to set out the coffee utensils, but the guests categorically refused coffee, citing urgent business. Christopher promised to pick up the visa at 18 o'clock. That was the end of it. Lisa finally unfolded the magazine, but she couldn't read it. Sebastian's face loomed before her eyes. Lisa chased away the thought, inappropriate for a married woman. But she couldn't help herself. She knew one thing for sure. She liked Sebastian. The upcoming evening made her dizzy, and Lisa hummed to herself and began to try on her evening gown. The opera was wonderful. As always, was at the top of her game. The audience applauded for a long time and did not want to let her go after the performance. Lisa and her companions got into their own Sebastian carriage and went to the Metropole. By the time they arrived, the restaurant was full, but Sebastian had booked a table in advance. After a while, their company was joined by herself. She kissed Christopher playfully, gave Sebastian a friendly nod, and smiled at Lisa. Everything that was happening made her dizzy. It was a charming evening, and Sebastian seemed like a true English gentleman. "You have a very delicate nature," he whispered in Lisa's ear as he refilled her glass of red wine. Lisa was pleased by the young man's attention. She nodded and smiled at the corner of her lips. "Do you have such an expressive face, like in old Italian paintings?" The intrusive bow didn't stop. "Any artist would be happy to paint your portrait. Just a face." Unexpectedly, with coquettish Lisa, Sebastian was embarrassed for a moment, then began complimenting her with even more fervor. The gypsies sang and danced, and a young lady in bow came on stage. They held hands and froze in anticipation of the music. A guitar played and the dance began. The music was unusual, but extremely passionate. So was the dance. The partners moved quickly on the stage in a single impulse. It seemed that love and passion were about to engulf them both. The guitar played louder. It was joined by another music, then hushed, then played loudly. Finally, the partner surrendered and threw herself on her beau's arm. The hall exploded with applause. "What is the name of this dance?" Lisa asked with a gasp. "Tango." Sebastian replied condescendingly. "Soon it will conquer the whole of Europe." By the end of the evening, Lisa was already quite tipsy, and when Sebastian offered to see his collection of bronzes brought from England, she unexpectedly agreed. She was back in her familiar environment. She revolved among the nobility and bohemians, and therefore saw nothing criminal in going to see the collection of statuettes of a young man hitherto unknown to her, especially when accompanied by her brother and his companion. Sebastian lived in a spacious apartment in Schmidt's house, almost in the very center of St. Petersburg. They all sat for a while longer, drinking a bottle of old French wine. Then, after coffee, Christopher discreetly disappeared with his girlfriend into one of the rooms. The wine was drunk, and the atmosphere cozy. Pushed to madness, Lisa never fully realized how she had ended up in Sebastian's bed, staring intently into his eyes. She gave herself without foreplay, and only when she felt him inside her. She remembered Stephen, but after a few sweet moments, she forgot again. Responding to his caresses, she sensed that Sebastian had a lot of experience with women. When he entered, she felt a hot warmth spill over her body. She felt so good with him that she soon. Lisa wanted nothing more. She wanted it to continue indefinitely. In the morning, remorse came over her. With her mind, she realized that she had cynically betrayed her husband that night. But she felt so good that she didn't want to leave her new acquaintance. Then Christopher appeared with his mistress, and they had fun again, forgetting everything. Several times Lisa caught a rather smirking grin from her brother. Lisa did not return home until the next day, consumed by passion. She had not even considered that Stephen might have returned. After a few years of quiet, measured life with her husband, Lisa felt happy and so desirable. She felt no particular remorse. "I just didn't know what to do next, whether to end the relationship with Sebastian immediately or, on the contrary, to continue it." She did not consider the time spent in her lover's bed to be cheating. Lisa was not going to leave her husband. Well, regretted a little, not washed off. She continued to love Stephen, and even wanted to have children with him. Or she did, but not with him. She was quite satisfied with a secure life with her husband, his calm, non-fanatical love. But Sebastian's heart was sweetly flooded and butterflies fluttered in her stomach. Sebastian, before going to bed, he would walk around the room completely naked for a while, giving Lisa the opportunity to admire his body, completely confident in its beauty. And then it was back to kissing, thrusting, and she would dive headfirst into the hot waves of pleasure. I woke up to a quiet knock at the door. "Get up," Varen heard the soft voice of the landlady. I jumped out of bed, noting the valise next to the bed. I opened it with a jerk and made sure that the revolver was still there. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to the hall. There were no traces of last night's battle. The floor was cleanly washed. There was breakfast on the corner table. I ate quickly and paid. I thought for a while and put a nickel on top. "For your trouble." When I kissed the hospitable hostess's hand and headed for the door, she called out to me, "Mr. Marlowe, do I have a present for you?" She picked up a cane standing in the corner and held it out to me. "It will be easier for you with it." I took a separate bronze-weighted stick and hung it on my arm. The hostess looked at me with a grin. Suddenly, I understood everything. With my hand, I touched the handle in the shape of Razimu Snake's mouth and turned it gently. In a moment, a rather wide blade appeared in my hand, gleamed predatorily. In the light of the sunbeam, it was brought by my late husband, but he did not have time to use it. Tears glistened in the eyes of my hostess. "Have a safe journey. Take care. I'll pray for you." She kissed me on the cheek and baptized me with the sign of the cross. Charles was waiting for me in the yard, sitting on the front of the cart. He looked as if nothing had happened, smiled welcomingly at me smoking his duck. "It's time to go. Baron, we'll be there by lunchtime." Gray-haired Charles picked up the reins. I put my valise on the cart. The cart was lined with fresh hay, covered with a cloth-colored blanket. While I was getting settled, did the man make a face at the squeak? The wagon moved off. It was not so hot today. Soon the road slid into the woods, and it was even a little cooler. The fluffy business boughs formed a kind of pollock over the forest inn. The sun's rays hardly broke through the thick needles, and soon dusk enveloped the whole place. At one point, it seemed to me that once the train all the way to the ground spruce trees were about to close around us forever, shutting out the sun in my soul, slowly began to rise unrecognized, sitting in the very depths of consciousness, primal fear of the forest. I even cocked my head a few times, as if I wanted to ward it off. This obsession. Charles from the mountains, who had killed, sat on the front of the cart, and from time to time, as if reluctantly, drove the reins of the sadly coming horse. I lay down on the summer-smelling hay, putting my valise under my head, and watched the decayed and spruce trees slowly floating by. The cart bounced sharply. It hit a bump. The forest road narrowed noticeably. The paws of spruce trees were already clinging to the sides of the cart. Like the hands of ghouls, Charles smoked his stinking duck unperturbed. "This place is a death trap. All sorts of creatures." Suddenly he spoke. I looked around involuntarily. If there was a forest undead here before, it hasn't gone anywhere. So it lives among timid swamps and in thick, impenetrable groves. "There's a lot to see here." As if reading my thoughts, Charles said, "Don't take off your cross." I involuntarily fumbled for the silver cross hanging on a chain under my clothes. The cart ran on buds and roots protruding from the ground. Finally, we came to the edge of a rather large clearing. At its edge stood a large one-story wooden house surrounded by a metal fence. It had now slipped and fallen down in places. It was obvious that the estate was missing its owner's hand. There was a smell of smoke mixed with the odor of water. Well, here we are. This is the Russian's estate. It's not a nice place. Nothing but swamps. Charles crossed himself. "Goodbye, Baron. Maybe I'll see you again sometime." I took out some money to pay the freedman, but Charles shook his head negatively. He quickly turned the wagon around in the cart, bouncing on kidneys, disappeared into the woods. A moment later, the pitiful neighing of a horse reached me. The next morning, Sebastian sent Lisa a huge bouquet of red roses, and she couldn't resist. She spent the night in his arms again. The vicious liaison was addictive. Lisa spent almost all her evenings with her lover, almost always staying overnight. At some point, she realized it wasn't love. Lisa was sure she would not trade her husband for a lover. Every time she got into the carriage sent for her, Lisa convinced herself that it was the last time. But she couldn't help herself. So she went to see her lover again and again. "What could you possibly have in common with this junk in your cheeks, kissing a young woman?" Sebastian asked. "This is a man not of our circle. Living with him will defame you and your family. Don't forget, you are a born Princess Vyazemskaya. Stay with me, and I'll throw the whole world at your feet. You'll be what you should be again." Passion surrounded the head of Lise. I didn't feel like talking. She only pressed her lover's head more tightly to her breast, giving her whole body and soul to his caresses. A week passed from Stephen. There had been no news. Despite the adventures of love, Lisa's heart was troubled, and Sebastian was becoming more and more insistent. He was already jealous of her husband, and Christopher was adding fuel to the fire. "What do you want?" "It's a good match. A rich, intelligent nobleman. Give up your miser, saber, and take your place in society again." He persisted in persuading his sister. Take his money and move in with Sebastian. but it's indecent. Stephen is my husband. Lysa weakly resisted, realizing with her mind that there was a rational grain in her brother's proposal, especially since Sebastian is so sweet. But when her lover presented Lysa with a gold and diamond necklace, she trembled with her brother's help. Lysa opened the safe in her husband's office, took all the cash and bank-bearer bonds. With almost 5,000, she packed up her belongings and moved in with Sebastian. Not a week had passed since Stephen's departure. Meanwhile, taking my valise in my left hand and keeping my cane in my right, I made my way toward the miraculously surviving drama. As I approached, looking more closely at the bar house, the ordinary large house gradually over the decades took on the features of a typical mansion typical of the northwestern region. One story with a roof island and attic with boarded-up windows. A handsome, carved, oak door and leather iron lanterns hung on either side of the front entrance above the entrance itself, painted portico supported by 4 antique-style columns, which gave the house itself a certain playfulness and frivolity. But despite the mix of architectural styles, the house inspired an unmotivated fear. Its seemingly frivolous architectural excesses not only did not soften this impression, but instead gave the house an inexplicable gloominess and mystery. I was unfamiliar with this architectural style peculiar to these gloomy, swampy woods. Behind the house stretched a dense business forest stretching for many kilometers. The front was closely adjoined by an old neglected park, in which once well-kept fruit trees protruded from yellowed weeds, spreading their branches like Black Oscar's evil hands. The facade of the mansion. There was that painted in yellow-green color, the light of bureaucratic boredom, and about that vividly creepy. However, from painting little remained, as the plaster mostly fell off. Survived triangular gables and above the windows, whose Renaissance austerity has been softened, and the plaster wigs are tall. The narrow 3 or 4 windows reminded me of the end of history and the former greatness of the owners, leaning lightly on a cane. I approached the front doors at the entrance. Suddenly, a sense of inexplicable danger made me look back. Right behind my back, about 3 meters away, pinning his ears and menacingly here motionless, froze a huge gray wolf. He didn't make a sound, only not dog-like lower his fluffy tail to his hind legs. His fierce, non-running gaze on his bloodshot eyes held me as if in its crosshairs. "Who is it?" An unexpected voice in the silence brought me out of my daze. Trying not to make any sudden movements, I slowly turned around. On the stone porch stood a gray-haired old man, clutching a long antique shotgun pointed at me. It was clear that it was loaded, as there was a smoking wick in his left hand, which he held down with his thumb. He had a rather brave appearance, a tanned, wrinkled face, on his head, on a genuine white wig, thin, taut in the room, tied with a wide belt, similar to Slutsky's, on legs spread apart, soft, brown boots with busy upward noses. Grandfather, in spite of his tender age, held a rifle, very confidently ready to fire at any moment from such a distance it was impossible to miss. I set the valise down carefully and held up my hands. "Don't shoot. I am from Street Petersburg. I have business with your mistress." I tried to speak smoothly, so as not to frighten the old soldier. The old man was silent, apparently trying to decide what to do. I smiled. "My name is Stephen Marlowe. Report me to Mrs. Russian." My voice was sweeter than honey. "There is no Mistress Ruska Jadwiga here. The mistress of this manor." Importantly, said the old man in Russian, her brother. I was relieved. It seemed I had come to the right place. Now it was very important to meet with the mistress and learn from her about the fate of the collection. The old man grabbed his gun and disappeared out the door. I turned my head. The wolf was still standing behind my back, keeping his yellow eyes on me. Finally, the door opened again and the same old man appeared on the porch, but this time without a gun. "Pani Jadwiga asked you to come through." The old man opened the door, letting me into the house. Elegantly bowing my head and crossing the threshold, I looked back. The wolf was gone. I looked up, head and looked up at the piercing blue sky with white clouds, and the blue sun hangs in the sky for a long time, as if it doesn't want to give up its rights to the night. But then, as if realizing, it instantly disappears and darkness falls on the earth. I climbed up to the voyage and stepped inside the house, the musty air of old age and decay. It hit me in the face. I looked around. A spacious hallway of its own size, more like a dance hall. A wooden staircase leading up to the attics. In the right corner of the hall, a large fireplace made of wild stone, which was brought to these places 1,000 years ago by a glacier. It was obvious that the fire had recently been lit on the walls of the temples with ancient paintings by long-forgotten artists, mixed with hunting trophies. The horns of skull heads of animals, hunted at different times, were placed on special medallions covered with black lacquer. From time, the lacquer in some places was drawn and crumbled, which gave the interior some sinister part. From the ceiling on chains, from the paddle, a huge bronze chandelier with lice, a gorocomb of candles, like the fireplace. It too had been recently lit. A bit of furniture, worn, upholstered, and an ebony table completed the interior. From the hall to the depths of the house led several doors, and I stopped in indecision. What can I do for the gentleman? An elderly lady, accompanied by a young maiden, came out to meet me. Allow me to introduce myself. Marlowe Stephen the antiquary. I bowed my head. I have business with you. We could talk in private. I did not want to start a serious conversation on the fly in the presence of a stranger, especially since I recognized in the girl the very drunkenness for which I got into a fight with the local Don Juan. Judging by the sparkling eyes, the girl also recognized me, but she tried not to show it. I have no secrets from my niece. The lady threw her head down angrily. Cindy, make us some coffee. Let's go into the living room. The hostess made an inviting gesture and headed for one of the doors. We were seated in the large room at a round table. Cindy brought a tray from the coffee pot and cups and poured the coffee. I took a sip out of politeness and marveled. The coffee was very good. So what business do you have with me? The hostess said dryly and looked me in the eye. I outlined the essence of the matter, telling about a favorable deal on the sale of the collection. I was ready to pay the money right now in gold or assignats. I was trying to say something else when the landlady stopped me. My brother spent his life wandering the world, collecting his vile collection. God punished him for it by giving him a disease that killed him. He left behind Cindy, his daughter. Who the mother is, I don't know. That's another of his sins. I looked at the Japanese woman. She had her head down, and was not at all like the unleashed maiden I had seen in the cards. I have burned this lewd gathering so that it will not tempt anyone, continued the hostess. That will be all, Mr. Marlowe. I think the matter is over. It's too late to spend the night at the manor. Tomorrow Jack will take you to the nearest whiskey. She got up and left without saying goodbye, followed by Cindy. After a quick glance at me, Jack, who acted as a watchman and footman, led me into a room that had apparently been a study. A desk, an armchair, a sofa against the wall, and a fireplace. Above the sofa was a portrait of a beautiful young woman in a dress with letters. I did not want to go to bed and decided to spend the night on the sofa. I put my valise at the headboard, put my revolver under the pillow, and placed my cane next to it. God protects the wiser. I was already asleep when there was a knock at the door. Jack brought supper. A long tablecloth, white on starch, was tentatively set on the table. As if by magic, even bowls of sauerkraut, pickles, and pickled breasts appeared, separated by a footman. A bowl of raw eggs on a small plate lay neatly on a reasonable lard with a solid meat layer. Finally, a hot cast iron with stew, potatoes, and a wonderful one appeared on the table. Jack went out and quickly returned with a Countess Wild cold vodka. Here now the still life could be considered finished while I ate. It was already getting dark. The sun was hidden behind a reasonable fence from the tops of fir trees immediately pulled cold. Autumn was inexorably taking its toll. Jack. He melted the fireplace and said good night to me. Having settled down on the sofa, I drank vodka. Pleasant warmth began to develop slowly. Moonlight penetrated into the room through the long-ago unwashed window, leaving a light path on the floor and wall. I closed my eyes. The events of the past day raced through my head, keeping me awake. I lay blissfully awake. All over my body was paying out, sweet from home. For the first time in ages, I felt calm and peaceful. I glanced at my watch in the not-too-bright glow of the eternal flame. The hand showed 22 o'clock, early by city standards. But here in the forest wilderness, it was late night. Life surrounded by wild, untouched nature seemed to me clear and simple. One should get up at dawn, go hunting, fishing for mushrooms, have dinner in the evening, and go to bed early. Forest swamps, gun, fire, lack of stress, and a healthy lifestyle contribute to longevity. I envy the people who live here. I'd give up everything to live here in the middle of nowhere and live out my life in peace and quiet. I thought, falling asleep. I didn't understand why I woke up. I lay there for a few minutes, pondered where I then opened my eyes. The candle was burning and went out, but the room was quite bright from the color of the full moon streaming through the window. Suddenly, a distinctive sound came from the hallway, slamming the door. I sat up and took the revolver in my hand. What is it? Without putting on my boots, I went to the door and listened. Someone was walking slowly down the hall. Could it be Jack going around the house? Acting as watchman or landlady, unable to sleep, snapped loudly, and the sound of footsteps came closer and closer. I opened the door slightly. I could clearly see a part of the corridor, dedicated by moonlight. Well could be heard. Footsteps clinked together, but I couldn't see anyone. I began to feel uneasy. It was damned funny. From outside, the faint but distinct barking of a dog reached me. I went back to the window and looked down, but I couldn't see anyone, no matter how hard I tried. As soon as I heard that barking, goosebumps ran down my spine. Even now, years later, it's hard for me to say why I reacted the way I did to an ordinary dog barking. But back then, in the house, I only gripped the grip of my revolver tighter. I listened. The footsteps died away, and I suddenly realized that there was someone or something at the door. And somehow I was sure that something terrible was waiting for me. Trying to make as little noise as possible, I slowly cocked the trigger with my thumb, cautiously approached the door, and then swung it open. Meanwhile, life together with Sebastian Lisa seemed like paradise at first. She bathed in his love, paying little attention to what was going on around the money, actually stolen from her husband. She gave it to Christopher for safekeeping. He lucidly explained to Lisa that it would be more secure with him. But after a while, Lisa began to feel a guilty conscience. She was worried that she had been so mean to Stephen, abandoning and robbing her own husband. It wasn't easy to get it out of her head. She tried to forget herself in unrestrained merriment, but the black thoughts came back to her and kept her awake, especially at night. Sebastian and Christopher told Lisa about the bright prospects of the near future. Sebastian suggested going to the church court and asking for permission to hear, but Lisa realized that her chances of becoming a free woman were very slim. True, there was one catch. If she could accuse her husband of adultery, even the church court could rule favorably on her case. When she had spoken to Sebastian about it, he had grasped at that straw with enthusiasm. It was only a matter of finding bribed witnesses and filing for divorce. At the same time, Lisa and her brother decided to petition the emperor for the return of Lisa, title, and nobility. Her husband had taken advantage of her family's plight and almost forcibly married her. Here, too, there was hope that all would turn out well. In the meantime, Lisa and her friends continued to spend Stephen's money without denying themselves anything. But no matter how much Lisa tried to forget herself, she waited with fear for her husband's return, realizing that under the law of the empire he had every right to forcibly bring her home. One evening, as she and Sebastian drank a bottle of Chateau Renault, Lisa asked her lover what they would do if the courts didn't work out. Sebastian thought for a moment, then said, I have good connections with the social revolutionaries. They're quiet now, but I can make arrangements with the right people, and your Stephen will be gone in one fell swoop." Lisa shuddered at these words, but her status as a widow promised her tantalizing prospects. Giving her access to Stephen's main money, she wiped away her tears and smiled blissfully. Meanwhile, I cautiously approached the door and then swung it open sharply. No one was there. I only felt a slight breeze blowing in. Without letting go of my weapon, I stepped out into the hallway and made my way down the hall. All was quiet. There was something lying on the bottom step of the stairs leading to the attic. I bent down and gingerly picked up a small object, a small spearhead made of white metal, most likely silver. It had a leather lanyard on it. It was an amulet. Apparently, it had once adorned the chest of a warrior. The amulet was made in the Oriental style and decorated with intricate ornaments. Did someone drop it or plant it on purpose? I took it in my hand. How could it not be here? I decided to appropriate it. Putting the amulet in my pants pocket, I went back into the room, closed the door at the ankle, and laid down on the couch again. After a while, sleep watched me. I woke up to a chilling, howling human scream. Yes, carrying everything from the street. A gunshot rang out. I rushed down the stairs, shoving my feet into my boots as I went. Hardly had I run out of the house when a flock of bats flew over my head, flapping their wings loudly. I turned my head and saw a vague shadow flicker in the distance. A group of hastily dressed people were crowding about 50 meters away from the house. As I got closer, I saw the body of a confused man lying on the ground. He was already dying. His voice was weakened. He kept mumbling something in an unknown language. Then he stretched out and froze forever, turning into a heap of ugly flesh on the soft earth around him and wiping the body anew. The footprints of some giant animal were clearly visible. 2 men covered the body with leather and dragged it onto a stretcher. The mistress standing nearby wrapped a woolen shawl around the body, then said something quietly to Jack, who held the billet, the gun, and slowly walked toward the house. No one paid the slightest attention to me. The people around me seemed to understand perfectly well what the matter was, and to them there was nothing unusual about it. I put my revolver behind my belt and walked to the door of the study. I had a feeling that there was someone inside. I cautiously opened the door and saw a female figure on the sofa, illuminated by the bright moonlight. Hearing the door creak open, the woman turned around. God, I even flinched. It was Cindy. Illuminated by the moonlight, beautiful face, the same white dress. The girl walked up to me without saying a word. She took my hand and led me to the couch. From surprise, I lost the ability to resist. I woke up from a hot, long kiss. I carefully moved away from the young body. "I'm sorry, I can't. I have a wife." I mumbled a little audibly. "She's not here. I want you." She covered my face with kisses, trying to pull my jacket off my shoulders. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a prude or a slacker. I've had women in my life, young and not so young, but I've been married. And most importantly, I love my wife. I couldn't go back on the vows I made at the altar. To be together for better or for worse, to die on the same day. I'm sorry, Cindy. I can't. You're very beautiful, but I'm not free. I said something else, trying not to offend the girl by saying no. Finally, she quieted down and just sat there, pressed against me. "Are you looking for a collection or something?" Suddenly she asked, fixing her bangs. Pani Jadwiga burned it, but a small part of it survived. "I'll show you." She was silent for a moment, as if hesitating to tell me something. "I'll show you where it's hidden. But you'll take me away from here," she said firmly. "Where from?" the surprise. I asked a stupid question. "I don't care where. As long as it's away from here. I can't stay here any longer." The lady grabbed me from Mr. Corbin. He's in his 70s. He's already paid for me in gold. Cindy suddenly sobbed. "I'd rather drown myself. What's life like that? She's your aunt." I shuddered at her sobs. "She's not my aunt. I'm her brother's adopted daughter. He took me from the orphanage 6 years ago, kept me here until he died. Now my aunt wants to make a profit off me. Cindy grabbed my hand. Take me out of here. I'm gonna be lost anyway. She fixed her bangs again with that familiar motion. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't remember anyone who'd ever done it. In fact, Cindy reminded me of someone. But who? I looked at the beautiful face. I stroked the silks, the clean hair. It gave off an odor, the faint scent of drunken jasmine. It was as if I could read her mind. Take me away, my love. Don't leave me, she whispered. I've waited so long for you, love and moons. The scent of jasmine. The girl lit the lantern and stood up. Come, I'll show you the collection. I stood in a damp cellar, and before me on a hastily made fairy tale of rotten floorboards, on a pedestal stood a coffin covered with mold and bits of clay. It was evident that it had long rested in the cemetery soil. Once made of oak planks, it was now a pitiful sight. The lid was pulled off, and well-preserved human remains came into view. In some places the bones were shattered, but on the whole the skeleton was well preserved, the skull with long hair, fangs, and empty eye sockets. Next to the skeleton lay a sword, but even without this attribute it was clear to me that it was a warrior. But that's not what struck me. On the chest of your corpse on a leather lanyard hung an amulet, exactly like the one I found on the stairs 2 hours earlier. I don't know why, but I was suddenly overcome with terror. I lost the ability to think and move. A creature with brightly glowing eyes was approaching me. It came so close that I could hear its angry breathing. Suddenly it grabbed me with its paws and teeth, batted at my neck. I felt the pain of the bite, and a warm trickle of blood ran down my chest. I snapped out of my fake nightmare. The sun was shining outside the window. On the table was a white towel-covered breakfast of toasted slices of white bread, butter, and a pot of hot coffee. Honestly, I didn't yet realize where was dream and where was reality. I remembered well how the jar and I had gone down to the basement, how she had shown me the straw-covered boxes that held the cloth-wrapped wooden figures. Even at first glance, they were worth a fabulous amount of money. Then Cindy left, and I fell into this nightmare. I even leaned in. It was so natural. Well, it was time to leave. Just how to get the collection and the pit. The door shrieked and Jack came in. Good morning, Baron, he said respectfully. Cindy has told me everything. Help her, Baron. She's a good girl. She doesn't belong here. Jack wished with his lips and continued. The wagon is ready for you. I've put the boxes of dolls in there and covered them with hay. Cindy will be waiting for us at the fork behind the old cemetery. It's not far from here. Mrs. Jadwiga has gone to Kuma's and won't be back until tonight. I'll take you straight to the station. Hurry up, Baron. In the meantime, I don't think there'll be any trouble. Sebastian took a sip of wine, clearly savoring the drink. How soon we solve our case. Sebastian looked at Lisa. What's the holdup? As soon as the object appears in the city, we do it right away. Don't worry, everything will be honorable and noble. The mosquito won't poke its nose in. The man sitting opposite Sebastian looked expressively at the empty bottle of Take Down the Satrap. That's the only way to do it. Sebastian wrinkled his nose. Is he drunk or what? He nodded to the sex man. Some kind of inadequate. But he didn't say anything out loud. The interlocutor was drinking a second bottle. After all, he was pestering about revolution and terror. They were starting to pay attention. Sebastian put the envelope with the money under the tablecloth and bowed out. I'm waiting for the result on the street. Lisa cried. She suddenly felt sorry for her husband. But then she remembered the money and Sebastian, and the sadness receded. Ah, if only it could be done without killing. Sebastian jumped into the span and cradled his mistress's left body. Lisa sighed and kissed his cheek. I love you so much, sweetheart. An hour later we pulled up to the old cemetery, pulling in on both sides of the road. Judging by the general desolation, the gnarled monuments and broken hailstones, no one had been buried in the cemetery for a long time. There was silence all around. Not even the sound of the wind could be heard. The place was definitely haunted. I wandered at night between the mossy gravestones with inscriptions in an unknown language, which no one could read. I even got a little creepy. But I realized it wasn't ghosts I had to fear, it was living people. Come on, Cindy. You picked a good place to meet. Jack looked at me with a frown, as if he'd read my mind in that abandoned January cemetery. There are such people in this land, and no one can read the inscriptions, not even the Braves. The inscriptions are badly erased. I marveled at the knowledge of the village man. I'd heard something about them. They fought a long battle with the Slavs who came to this land from the west. The wars lasted for 100 years until these people assimilated with the invaders, but they preserved their language and their culture to this day. At the edge of the cemetery, Cindy was waiting for us, dressed in high-lifted traveling gowns. Seeing our carriage, she deftly jumped on it and smiled dreamily. Her thoughts were already in Street Petersburg. I did not share her optimism, if only because horsemen appeared from the turn. When they saw us, they quickly headed in our direction. It was immediately clear to me that we would not be able to escape. 4 armed guards of the county police, led by an associate. "Wait, who are they?" shouted the eldest, holding his horse. "People from out of town. We're going to the station." Did I answer as politely as possible? "We have documents." The ranger kept a suspicious look on my face. "Kuzmik, look, there's a girl." A young voice sounded behind me. I turned around. One of the guards had pulled Cindy's handkerchief off, and her blonde hair fell over her shoulders. "She's all right," the young one laughed. "Give me the papers." The guard leaned toward me and held out his hand. At that moment, there was an indignant shout from Cindy. The guard got off his horse and shamelessly searched for the girl to the loud laughter of his associates. "I thought you were the police, but you're a gang of guards." Disappointedly stretched out I. "Are you literate?" The town officer swung to hit me with a whip, but did not have time. The revolver struck the shot. The policeman dropped the whip and grabbed his arm. I ran up to him and pulled him off his horse, put the revolver to his temple. "Come on, hurry up," I shouted to his troops. Guns on the ground. Fearfully sticking their Glizzen Abbas at me, the soldiers slowly got off their horses. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. I shot into the air. The horses bucked fearfully and rushed down the road. "You're finished," came the voice of the older man. "He'll rot at the penal colony." I did not deny myself the pleasure of striking him in the teeth with the handle of my revolver. Now he was busy, spitting out splinters of teeth with Jack's blood. "Gather the guns in the cart," I commanded the valet. "And don't shake. You'll be all right," while Jack panted. Cindy hopped off the wagon, quickly picked up the rifles that had been thrown on the road, then stood there as if thinking about something and quickly kicked the young guard in the butt with the toe of her boot. He screamed and bent almost to the ground. Apparently, he was collecting eggs on the road. The officer, clamping his bloody mouth, found it necessary to keep silent. "Now let's get out of here." I jumped into the cart and nodded to Jack. "Pull the cart." Cheerfully jammed, body over the potholes, leaving behind defeated troops of the land police. Evenings. Soon the station was to appear. We drove through the forest and into a less well-maintained inn. The sound of hoof stomping reached my ear. A gendarme cavalry troop came out of the forest. Yes, these are not the Zemstvo police. They do it without blinking an eye, I thought, and that's a lot of military men today. Skokov in front of the detachment. The staff captain raised his hand. The horsemen surrounded us. "Who are they?" The commander spoke calmly, feeling behind him strength. "We were on a visit. We're going to the station now." I spoke calmly too. The officer looked at his watch and suddenly said, "It's 2:00 before the train, so you'll make it in time." Marlowe, I looked carefully at the staff captain. Holy shit, it's Joe. Our bunks were next to each other at the junior college. "This is the meeting." Joe jumped off his horse and came up to me. "Well, hello, devils. We hugged. "Can I have a word with you?" I touched my classmate's sleeve. We stepped aside, whispered a little. Then Lieutenant Redchinsky himself gave the order. "Take the men and go back. There are policemen somewhere on the road. Pick them up and take their weapons from the cart. Smith and Joseph, stay with me. We'll escort Mr. Marlowe to the station." The train arrived at St. Petersburg. Early in the morning, I hired a coachman and a loader. They moved the crates of dolls to the cart. Cindy and I got into the aisle and drove to my house. I decided not to keep anything from Lisa, knowing her kind nature. She must be sympathetic to the poor girl's plight. When I entered the apartment, my favorite wife did not meet me in the kitchen. Only the maid Wendy came up to meet me. She confusedly told me that Lisa had gone away a week ago with some young man and his brother. Well, I knew her brother. He was forgiving. 2 meetings were enough for me to turn him down. But who was the other one? From what the maid told me, Lisa ran away with my money. Not a great loss, but I left Cindy in Wendy's care. I sat down on the couch and thought about what to do next. I'd only been gone a little over a week. I'd already lost my wife and my money. Ugh, money. To hell with the wife. Here's the rub. What could have happened in such a short time that she had ruthlessly stepped over my love? For me, there was no alternative. Kick her to the curb. But still, what influenced her? Was it princely hubris or an unsatisfied vanity? I took out a bottle of cognac and poured myself a full shot. How is it our way? Drown your sorrows in cognac. But I didn't have time to drink it. There was a loud knock at the door. In a minute, Wendy brought into my office a young military-looking officer in a blue uniform, handed me a sealed Surguta packet. While I read, the sub-lieutenant stood silently and looked at me faithfully. "Everything is clear." I folded the paper. "Mr. Captain, the carriage is waiting downstairs. I've been ordered to bring you here at once." The officer clicked his heels kindly. "Give me 15 minutes. I put the package on the table. I dressed quickly, shook the dust off my epaulets, and strapped on my checker. "Wendy, take care of Cindy. I need to get away." I put on my cap. Ah, it sounded behind me. Cindy, eyes wide open, rushed in surprise at me dressed in an officer's uniform in full parade. I grinned in satisfaction. Damn it, it's nice to make young ladies lose their minds at the sight of you. His Excellency is about to perceive. The young adjutant grumbled and swung the door open. I walked across the soft carpet to a large oak table, at which sat a not yet old state general in a dress uniform. "Come in, Stephen." He waved his hand cordially, showing me to a soft leather sofa, in front of which stood a service table. The adjutant filled shot glasses and moved a plate with an appetizer. "I won't tell you what this is all about. You'll find out soon enough." Vaughn grinned slyly. "In an hour we are waiting for the sovereign." I even choked up cognac stuck in my throat. "Who is waiting?" I asked through a cough. "Your Majesty." His Excellency patted me on the back. "Let's have a drink and get on our way." The state councilor corrected a strand of hair that had fallen on his face with a familiar gesture. I even flinched. I couldn't stop thinking about Cindy as we walked down the long corridor. I was happy for her, if I wasn't mistaken. That girl was going to do well. A chamber footman ushered us into a huge hall. A burly, bearded man rose from behind a large miscellaneous table. Emperor Alexander II came out to meet us. We stopped and bowed our heads. Your Majesty started to share, but the Emperor stopped him with a gesture. "Why the unnecessary words, gentlemen? Tell me, Joseph, have you thought about my proposal?" The Emperor's voice was soft, but in it you could feel the hidden strength of a man who left the whole of Europe trembling. "Yes, my lord, I agree." Dennis looked faithfully into the Emperor's eyes. The Emperor nodded with satisfaction. "And you, Baron?" I didn't realize at first which Raven we were talking about, except for the Emperor and us here. There was no one else in the hall. "He doesn't know yet." "Your Majesty," smiled Dennis. "He was not in St. Petersburg." Alexander II looked at me with a smile. 3 days ago, I granted your father nobility and the title of Baron for his invaluable help in building the Siberian Railroad. So you are now a second-generation Baron. The Emperor and Dennis laughed. I want to appoint you Deputy Chief of the Palace Police, the Emperor continued, and looked at my companion. That's his deputy. I didn't think for a long time. I agree. Well, then congratulations on the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The Emperor sat down at the table. Gentlemen, I give you a month to organize the department. Tonight I dined at a place not on the Moika. To tell you the truth, I didn't like the bohemian bustle of restaurants, but this evening I wanted to be among people. Loneliness was weighing me down. I didn't risk taking the whole with me. It looked very provincial. Knowing the morals of our and glamorous young ladies, I did not want to expose a nice girl to their ridicule. I was in euphoria from the events of today. First, the news of Lisa's betrayal and escape, then the visit to the sovereign. A new appointment, a newly acquired title and rank, all of which would have made anyone's head spin. I was sitting alone at a table, away from the hustle and bustle of the world. When I heard a familiar laugh, I looked up. Almost opposite me was a group of young people, among whom my wife was laughing. Even from here, I could see how she was looking at the gentleman with the thin mustache under his nose. Around their table, the waiters were bustling. Wine. Bring wine. One of the girls shouted loudly. And that's when Lisa saw me. Her face turned white. Her companion intercepted her gaze and stared at me too. Everything was mixed up in his gaze. Fear, insolence, arrogance. Without getting up, he summoned the maitre d'. I always thought your restaurant was for a clean crowd. Deliberately loud so I could hear, he said. The noise at their table died down. Everyone stared at me in silence, expecting a scandal and my ignominious expulsion from the Restoration. Yes, for the public that knows how to behave in a public place and with money, politely replied the meter man. Then what's this bullshit doing here? Sebastian nodded in my direction, and the maitre d' looked at me. I realized that Sebastian was known here, but it was the first time they had seen me. The maitre d' didn't know how to behave in such a case and didn't dare to do anything. I decided to come to his rescue. I rubbed my lips straight with a napkin, took my cane and approached a neighboring table. Don't worry, my good man. I'll take care of it in a moment. It's just a minor misunderstanding. I smiled affectionately at Sebastian. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eliza turn even more pale with fear, clutching the Lezginka in her chair. I turned to my wife. It seems to me that you have lost track of time. It's time to get ready to go home. There's a carriage waiting for us at the entrance. Sebastian jumped up. Lisa isn't going anywhere. I looked at my lover in amazement. My soul. Who is that boy in my voice? Only a fool could fail to sense the obvious sneer. Lisa shook her head, unable to utter a word. I would challenge you to a duel. You bastard. Sebastian was seething with rage. But you're not a nobleman, so get out of here. He grabbed me by the lapel of my jacket, seriously intending to throw me out of this noble establishment. Two young Shegolevs, who were sitting at the table, came up to help him. Here I realized that it was time to act. I sharply hit Sebastian with my knee in the groin, and while he mooed in pain, he raked his privates into a heap. I dropped the cane and with two palms hit him in the ears. It's the kind of blow that bursts eardrums. The pain is unbelievable. Sebastian even forgot from the pain. But that wasn't enough for me. I hit him in the jaw with my right hand. Sebastian was thrown up, and he flew into a corner, picking his way into a pile of empty tables. I turned to his companions. The young men were already seated and looking at me fearfully. It looked like this was the first time they had seen such a fight. I picked up my cane, glad I didn't need my sword. Lisa, I'm waiting, I said to my wife. It's time to go. She silently got up and walked out. I slipped the maitre d' $5 for material and moral damage. He nodded understandingly, tucking the money into his breast pocket. I followed Lisa out the door. I didn't want to talk to that lying bastard at all. But it was a matter of principle. As long as she's my wife, she should be home. I'll throw her out. When will I finally decide what to do with her? In the morning, a policeman came and took me to the courthouse. The elderly judge took a long look at me and wrapped Sebastian screws around which Lohankin was fussing. And the lawyer then asked me the question, "Why did you beat up this gentleman?" I shrugged. The man attacked me in front of witnesses. I was only defending myself. The judge hummed and looked at the renamed Sebastian again. "But you don't have a scratch on you. Witnesses show that you beat him methodically." The judge menacingly, frowning his eyebrows. "Especially since this gentleman is a nobleman. And you knew that?" "Yes, I did." "And what does that mean? Is his blood a different color, or is he immortal?" The judge was beginning to annoy me. The judge opened his mouth to put the bore in his place, which was me. As the courtroom creaked with boots cleaned, an adjutant of the chief of the palace police entered. He unceremoniously approached the judge and whispered something in his ear. The judge seemed to deflate. He looked at me with a completely different look. It was a look of genuine paternal concern. "Well, Stephen, why didn't you just say so?" He even stood up. "Mr. Barron, I'm dropping all charges against you. You are free to go." I stood up, turned around, and without looking at Mr. Sebastian, walked towards the exit. You should have seen the look on his face that very day. I brought the hole where they fight. They looked at each other in silence for a long time. Finally, a tear ran down Joseph's cheek. "Daddy!" The girl screamed and threw herself into her father's arms. What else can be added? Kinship is kinship. For years, Joseph was sure that his only daughter died in childbirth. I left the office without saying anything. They had a lot to talk about. A month later, the sovereign granted the divorce. I rented an apartment for Lisa and tried to forget her. You can imagine her state of mind when she found out she'd lost her nobility and title again. And the money, and her husband too. She tried to get back together with me, but as you can see, in vain. Betrayal is unforgivable. Lisa lived in Street Petersburg for a while, but then she sold her apartment and left. Her fate is unknown to me. Sebastian confused everything with the SRs and was soon shot by the police during an expropriation. Christopher Wyazemski lost at cards, so he was forced to sell the mortgaged estate. My father bought it and gave it to my mother as a reminder of her happy childhood. And I plunged into my work. I decided for myself, no more women. Enough. What else but trouble can you expect from them? I distanced myself from Cindy in every way possible. Excuse me, Cindy Joseph. Joseph officially recognized her as his daughter. She must have been hoping for something. But I made it very clear that I would not marry her under any circumstances. Cindy seemed to calm down. She was now selling a collection of Russian, and I hardly saw her. One evening in late November, I was sitting in my office and leafed through a fresh catalog, which I sent me from old memory my agent in Berlin. The doorbell rang, and Wendy announced that Cindy had come to pick up her things. A few minutes later, she entered my office. In her hands was one of the sculptures we had taken out of a young African man holding a jug. Cindy set it on the stone shelf. "This is a keepsake for you." Then she gaped at us for a moment. I shrugged, playing off indifference. Cindy stood for a moment longer and then suddenly asked if I could have something to keep as a souvenir. "Cindy, take anything you want. I loved that girl, but I couldn't help myself. Principals, gentlemen." "Thank you, Stephen." Blushing, Wendy called out. The maid brought an open bottle of champagne and 2 tall flutes. "Let's have a drink." Cindy sat down on the edge of the couch and handed me the wine flute. I lightly touched the rim of her flute and in one fell swoop drank the contents with the last thing I saw. Before I passed out Cindy's satisfied face, I opened my eyes to my chest. Something was pressing. I lowered my head slightly, and in the light of the boss I saw my female head. While building on my hairy chest, Cindy cautiously peeked under the blanket. Both me and the girl were unclothed. I didn't realize anything about how I ended up in bed with her. She felt me moving and opened her eyes. You said yourself that I can take anything I want as a memento. So I took you. I wanted to say something, but she covered my mouth with a passionate kiss.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Nancy left the school. Peter walked beside her, as usual. "But why are you leaving today?" "No, I guess I can't." Clara said she had to weed the potatoes. Nancy sighed. Ever since her father had brought that woman into the house, Nancy's life had been a living hell. Clara had looked for gain everywhere, and of course she had found it. Father worked in town a week there, a week at home. The week he was home was easier, of course. But when he was away, it started. The first thing, the stepmother decided to expand the vegetable garden and increase the number of livestock in the yard. Dad supported all her ideas, and Clara said, "As soon as the farm starts to bring profit, you can quit this job and work at home." "It would be good, Clara. I miss you and my daughter." The woman was pleased. She smiled. While Daddy was away, all the hard work was on Nancy's shoulders, but she didn't complain. She really wanted Daddy home too. Clara went to the market every 3 days. Nancy didn't know how much money she made there. But it must have been pretty good, because after a year, Daddy quit. The girl thought things would get easier, but it turned out to be much worse. On the first day, when the father was free at dinner, Clara said, "From tomorrow, we start building a new one. I've already ordered the material." "Clara, why is this stable only 5 years old?" "Well, this one's not going anywhere. There'll be an extra one." Father just sighed. Lately, they had only numbers instead of love in their eyes. Then he built a stable and a barn and a chicken coop. But Nancy began to notice that her father smelled more and more of drink. And there was such sadness in his eyes. Clara shouted she could warm him with a broom, but he kept drinking milk. Very soon, all the hard work again fell on her shoulders, because her father often could not do anything. The village grandmothers sighed. Such a man was ruined by his rubles, not a woman. Clara knew exactly what was being said about her. She argued and fought, almost throwing herself at everyone. Pretty soon, people in the village didn't even say hello to her, and she didn't care, to tell the truth. She didn't take anything from anyone. She earned everything herself. All the alkies and idlers, let them bite their elbows in silent envy. "Peter, you're not going to win a gold medal anyway." Nancy waved her hand. "Why do I need it, this gold medal?" "To put it in my room and admire it." "You wanted to go to college, didn't you?" "Who's going to let me go to that institute?" "My father on his hands and knees. Every day on the farm is huge." She sighed. Peter looked at her in amazement. "Nancy, what's wrong with you? You're out of your mind. You're the best in the whole school." "You wanted to be. How could I?" Nancy looked up at the sky. "It's okay. I'll get over it. Most people do. They get married, have kids, take care of the household. It's a different time. Peter, leave me alone. It is better to tell your grandfather how normal limping and a little so good." Nancy smiled. A week ago, a terrible event shook the village. It had long been said that the wolves were coming too close to the village, they said. But it's no use. They had a forester. If you could catch him sober once a week. They hoped that nothing terrible would happen. They were wrong. One night, the wolves swarmed the neighbor's fence and tried to take the dog off the chain. The owner jumped out. Neighbors. And Peter's grandfather, who is 100 years old. One didn't hesitate. Immediately grabbed the barrel from the wall. Yes, also in the yard to grab who grabbed. But only age gave its own way. The grandfather got confused and swung at the wolf in his leg. It's good that it only hit the soft part. But the rumble scared the wolves too. As they say, it was both a laugh and a sin. The grandfathers treated the whole village. Peter had only his mother and grandfather, so there wasn't much wealth. Everyone carried something tasty or useful to Grandpa Nick, who sacrificed himself for the sake of the rescue. Only one family was left out, and that, of course, was Nancy's family. Clara immediately said, "Well, if a man is a fool, it's forever. There's nothing to jump around like a young man at that age." Papa was as usual under the influence, and Nancy wouldn't even try. She was never listened to at all. You told your grandfather to correct himself. Listen, Nancy, which field are you going to weed? The farthest one, the one behind the village. So let me come and help you. Don't, Peter. No need. Don't you have your own things to do? Nancy said she realized that Peter would come and help, and they could spend the saved time on the river. And it made her so happy. And it appeared that you were all with Peter and 3 horses. You'll be on the street in no time. If you were a person, you'd be a country bumpkin nobody needs. Wouldn't you look at normal people? Nancy didn't even pay attention. That's how her stepmother always greeted her. Not Peter, not Peter, not Peter, not Peter, not Peter, not Peter. She'd think of something else. No matter how Nancy arrived, she'd be bombarded with accusations from the very doorstep. What she's hiding? Your daddy dragged your drunkard around on his back. Your back is gnawing at you too. Don't even think about it. Don't forget you're on potatoes. I remember about your potatoes. Nancy couldn't hold back any longer. She wanted to shout and stomp her feet, but she realized that the task would then fall on her head even more. Why is she mine? Are you guys eating with your daddy? Or maybe you eat air? Clara put her hands to her sides. Nancy realized that a scandal was about to break out, and it would look like a one-actor play, so it wouldn't come to that. She decided to take no offense and go straight to the field. Quickly, she changed her clothes. As Clara positioned herself and stepped out the door, she was already on her 3rd furrow. When did Peter show up? Not alone, but with his grandfather. Good health and truth. Hello, Grandpa Nick. How's your leg? What's it going to do? She walks more out of habit than anything else. She's long forgotten what pain is. Why is it walking and not like this in this heat? And what's the use of weeding it? We'll be digging soon enough. Nancy sighed. Grandfather grinned into his mustache. He was a wise, kind man. I know, don't say anything. Yours in the store is already scandalized by the wrong color of sugar. She needs yellow, and the store is white. Peter laughed. What's the difference? I thought yellow was bad. Well, I don't know. It is kind of considered to be sweeter. Grandfather sat down on the grass, looked at his grandson. Why don't you get up and go help the girl? Peter stood next to her, and they started pulling the grass with fury. Soon I smelled smoke. Grandpa had built a fire at the edge of the field. Dropped some potatoes from behind his sinuses, took out cucumbers, tomatoes. When there was less than half left, he called them over for a snack. Nancy had never had such a good meal. Obviously, of course, it's just potatoes. But how delicious. In general, in the company of Grandpa Nick and Peter, it was so homely, so nice and quiet. I knew your stepmother when she was a girl. That's why she doesn't like me so much. She's from a good family. Her father's a hard worker. Her mother killed his wife, and she's already driven one man to his grave. But she didn't get anything from the big farm. Her sister came to the funeral, and it turned out that the house and everything that belonged to it belonged to her. Only that Pebbles didn't tell her about it. In general, the stepmother lost everything. Then she's stuck to your father. Nancy stretched out thoughtfully. I wonder if Dad knows about it. Is Dad so in love with Clara that he doesn't notice? Yeah, there was a time when they were dating. Didn't anyone say anything to him? I can't help you there. I haven't seen your father in a while. And if I do, he's in no condition to talk. He drinks a lot. He drinks a lot. This guy was drinking at her place. Nancy at night, when she was already asleep, decided that as soon as she finished school, she'd go somewhere and take her father with her. He'd quit drinking, she'd make him, she'd talk him into it, and they'd get along. They'll be fine. And this one's got to run this place by herself. And winter was a little easier. Didn't have to be in the field, didn't have to be in the bed. Nancy even went for a walk once in a while. Peter, like a faithful guardian, was always there. To be honest, sometimes I'd like to be without him. But somewhere he'd take offense. In general, Nancy had more and more often thought that she should just marry well. Molly is only 2 years older than Nancy, and she got married in the next big village. Her husband, though older, treats her like a porcelain doll. Molly's mother told me that he takes her to school in the city by car and takes her back. Not only does he have a car, but he doesn't let her study. If Nancy could find such a man, she'd marry him right away. Peter, is Peter going to find a new subject in her life? On the other hand, Nancy realized that such luck was not common. Spring had come. Graduation exams loomed ahead. And what? And Nancy didn't know yet. There was no talking to her father about it, but her stepmother, much less what she would tell her. And also, understandably, well, something had to be done. So Nancy made up her mind, choosing a day when the stepmother was in a pretty decent mood. Nancy sat down at the table in front of her. Clara. Yes, she took a break from her calculations and looked at Nancy. That I should talk to you. The stepmother put aside the papers. Her face was serious. Well, let's have a talk. Nancy could see that the stepmother knew exactly what the conversation was about. Graduation is coming up. We have to apply somewhere. The stepmother grinned, not very friendly. We're somewhere else? But to the place where I'm going to study. The stepmother grinned and said, Will your daddy, or will I be someone else's aunt? You realize that my relative is of no use to me. Nancy blushed. Of course, there was logic in her stepmother's words. Her father had long since given her the finger. But what should Nancy do? You realize, Nancy, if you don't help with the chores, I'll have to hire a man. And that's a lot of money. So, no matter how hard I try, I can't give you any money. Anyway, if you're washing your hands of it, there's no reason for you to come here. So if you decide to go to school, I'll sell my family. You can forget it. Nancy almost cried. She'd been expecting something like that. But it was still a shame. But everybody goes to school. You're not everybody. You're in a completely different situation. Am I wrong? That's it. I think I've explained everything clearly to you. The stepmother got up and walked out. Nancy burst into tears. It's exactly as she thought. She's going to rot in this village like this. For a few days, Nancy walked on her own, not her mood. She even decided she wouldn't go to the prom. Peter was so annoying that there was no energy. One day, she came from school, sat on a bench in the yard, and sat in the barn. She heard a rustle. Strange. Stepmother left for the market in the morning. How'd she even get her driver's license? She bought herself a car, an old Jeep. She's been going into town a lot more often. Who's there? The girl carefully stood up, wanted to go to the door, but it opened by itself. Her father's head appeared. He was very drunk, and it was immediately obvious. Nancy sighed bitterly. Nancy doesn't have this one. And then Nancy was so angry that tears sprang from her eyes. What's it to you? Who's here? Who isn't? You can't see anybody anyway. You don't care about anyone but yourself. Dad, why do you hate me so much? Giving me to someone else's aunt. You're the one who's watering your eyes. Nancy, what are you talking about? What's the matter? I don't know what you're talking about. What am I saying? You know that everyone will go to school after high school. Your daughter will continue to clean cow's dung because Grandma doesn't want to do anything. He's more interested in drinking every day than thinking about his daughter. Nancy, wait, and don't cry. But the girl had already run into the house. Kevin sat down on the bench where his daughter had just sat and stared at himself. What a headache from all sorts of thoughts. The man raised his head and saw Grandfather Nick at the gate. Healthy. Grandpa's sick. I don't understand anything. Things are happening at home. Kevin waved his hand. No, she's gone to town. Grandpa Nick went into the yard, sat down next to her. What are you doing, Kevin? Peter says your girl won't let you go to school. Why not? But it's not for 1 year. You have to support her. Don't we have money? Maybe yours does. But I don't think you do. So what's the deal? Kevin lowered his head. He'd been tempted to come out of the barn just now. Nancy had heard her father and Clara talking in the kitchen that evening, talking rather than yelling and arguing. It was very strange because in the last couple years, normally they hadn't communicated at all. The girl tried to listen, but she couldn't make out the words. Half an hour later, Clara stopped by. Nancy, an idea how about us? The girl came out at the table, sat her father. He was gloomy. Clara pointed to a chair. Sit down. Nancy sat down. She looked at her father in amazement. Apparently, he was sober. Nothing to say. Stepmother. Nancy, your daddy swears he won't take another drop in his mouth. And he says he'll work 3 jobs just to keep you in school. and I can agree to that. But on one condition, if your dad gets drunk once, you drop out of school. Nancy agreed to everything. She realized that the most important thing was to get out of here. Then she'd figure it out. Maybe get a job, maybe something else. Nancy was already dreaming of a very different life. She didn't really know what it was like to live in the city. And to be honest, she didn't know what she'd do there all day long. But she wanted it so badly. A few years went by. Nancy had just gotten her paramedic's diploma and was about to get a job. She had a young man she planned to marry in the future. True, he wasn't a star, but he was a city boy. And he had an apartment, but he lived with his mom. But that didn't frighten Nancy. She was determined to be a good daughter-in-law. She had little contact with her father and stepmother. She went to see them once every 6 months and tried to get away as soon as possible. Nancy, there's an emergency phone call for you. The door of the dorm room opened, and Nancy saw the janitor on the doorstep. It was strange. Usually she was very reluctant to have any of the residents on the phone. Nancy walked out of the room. First she walked, then she ran. The receiver was on the table. Hello, Nancy. It's Andrew. Yes, Andrew, I'm listening. Here's the thing. Well, Nancy's dead. Yours were going to the city. Something apparently happened to the car. They flew into the ditch. There's a tree there. You need to solve everything here. Nancy dropped the phone, then slowly settled on the floor. How come? Someone handed her some water. Someone helped her into a chair. Nancy sat at the head of the table. Some of the neighbors gathered around the table. What grief is not old? He would have lived and lived. Yes, if he took a man to his senses. Even Garika began to restrain her, they said, and she somehow became calmer when he stopped drinking. A woman needs a real man, not a body. Nancy heard through the fog, but only one thing was going through her head. What to do now? When everyone had gone, Nancy began to wash the dishes. There was a knock at the door. Who was it? It was Peter. Nancy hadn't seen him in a long time. Probably the last time. How did he get into the army? Hello on the walls. Hello, Peter. I don't recognize you. And it was true. Peter had matured from a tall and gangly man to a sturdy, tall man. Peter, where are you from? Yes, I came to see my mother. She said you're here to drop by. Peter sat down at the table and looked around the kitchen. Well, it's you. I'm sorry for your loss. Thanks, Peter. She finished cleaning up, looked at him. Would you like a drink? Let's sit and remember Uncle Kolya. And his Clara, too. He was a man after all. Nancy put some sandwiches, a bottle, and a shot glass in front of him. Don't you have one for yourself? I don't drink. You can't drink. They're not strangers to you. Have a little drink and you'll feel better. I'm telling you. Nancy sighed and put down another shot. She tried it with the girls in the dorm, but it hadn't worked. Nancy, it didn't taste good. Nasty. You haven't smelled it. Drink as much as you can in one gulp and don't breathe. Pick a snack or some compote. Nancy did just that. The aftertaste wasn't great, of course, but it wasn't as bad as before. And after a few minutes, she felt her muscles relaxing, getting lighter. So let's do it again. Come on. Nancy woke up with a wild headache. She had absolutely no memory of going to bed last night. I turned my head and was amazed. Peter was sleeping next to me. Shit. What a funeral. She was out of her mind. The most frustrating thing was that she couldn't remember anything. Peter. He moved and turned to her. Nancy, but you're a fire. I tell you, you should drink more often. Peter, get out. Now before the village gets up and you what? I'm an adult. Go away. I'm begging you. Nancy didn't know what to say, so she blurted it out. I have a fiancé. Peter's eyes narrowed. A fiancé, you say? Why'd you jump into bed with me? Yeah, I'm the one who jumped into your bed. All right, I'll be right out. Peter got off in 2 seconds and walked out. Nancy cried. She didn't want to. She didn't want anything. After her childhood friend left, there was a lingering residue on her soul, as if she had wronged someone undeservedly. In the morning, Nancy went to the cemetery, sat on the fresh graves for a while. She cried, and on her way back, she saw Nick's grandfather. He was obviously waiting for her. "Hello, Nancy." "Hello, Grandpa Nick." "I wanted to talk to you, Nancy." The girl blushed thickly. "Old man, I haven't slept at all. Not at all. But I haven't slept today either. You know Peter is mine. I saw how he jumped out of your arms. He's going to town today. Mother's crying, and my heart's breaking too. He came here and promised to stay. What happened? Nancy. What could Nancy say to him? She thought that if she told him everything, all her dreams of city life, would come to an end. She loved the country, of course, but not so much that she couldn't even try to leave. And on the other hand, Peter, he had become such a city girl, her suitor was nowhere near him. Grandpa Nick, nothing happened. It was just sitting around. Nancy walked around the old man and down the path. She could feel his gaze burning her back, but she didn't turn around. 3 days later, she was leaving. She'd seen a glimpse of Peter still here, so she calmed down. Well, good, as much as she doesn't like him. And to connect her life with him she does not want. She knows him. Counting from diapers, what can be interesting in him? She's already packed her things and checked everything. What's off? What's not? Behind the household while the neighbor watches. Nancy promised to give her a young chick for it. The neighbor, the mother of the Molly that Nancy had once invited, sighed. Don't you worry, Nancy. I'll review everything. I'll do everything. Ninka will help. For the tree. Thank you. It's not easy for us right now. Molly, is Molly here, Nancy? Where would she be? She was married. You said it was fine. Aunt Kathy waved her hand. What was I supposed to say? That I got married over the summer, and there wasn't a day that went by without a beating. But I'd put up with it as long as I could. Then I had the baby in my arms. We barely fought off the bastard. Nancy was confused. Molly's life had been an example to her for so many years, and now this revelation. The neighbor left. Nancy sat down in the driveway. Nancy, that was Peter's voice. Is something wrong? She ran outside. Peter was almost to the door. Nancy, Grandpa's sick. Help me. It's the paramedic. Our paramedic's on his 3rd day. Nancy rushed into the house, grabbed the first aid kit she always carried in her bag. Didn't even lock the door, so she ran. Peter was running beside her, and he said he'd been pale in the morning, breathing hard. And at lunchtime, he got up from the couch and sat down again. I asked him what, and he just waved me off. He's not feeling well at all now. Nancy, help me. She stopped abruptly, so much so that Peter ran into her, because I'll do what I can, but you have to understand. How old is Nick 94's grandfather? He sighed like he was going to cry. Nancy silently skipped onward. Grandfather was very ill indeed. He was lying on the sofa and breathing with difficulty. Nancy immediately realized that he had a heart attack. She crouched down beside him and rummaged through the medicine cabinet. An hour later, he was feeling much better. Grandpa Nick, do you need to go to the hospital? I'm not going anywhere. That's all I need. I'll die at home. Grandpa said indignantly, What do you mean, die? Get those thoughts out of your head. Grandfather grinned, looked at his grandson. Do you think that at 94 life only begins? No, grandson. Everyone has his own destiny. And it's foolish to try to cheat fate. I've had a good life. Guys, everybody who's turning 70 has already cleaned up. Nancy and Peter went outside. Peter, I don't know what to do. To be honest, Grandpa Nick's condition is not good. He's not going to the hospital. I know my grandfather. Nancy looked at Peter, realized that he really cared about his grandfather. But you say the paramedic is drinking, and I have to go. Go. Peter wouldn't look at her. Peter, but I really need to go to my new job. No one's waiting for me. It's not like I'm holding you back, and I understand. Thanks for coming to see you off. Did Nancy shake her head? No, you don't have to. Go on then. There's a bus in an hour. Nancy walked down the street. After a minute, she turned around. But Peter was no longer in the yard. For the first time in her life, she wanted to stay in the village. She walked around the yard, figured out the dog behind his ear, then sat down on the bench. What am I going to do? She sat like that, looking at her watch. The bus had long gone. And what will she go tomorrow? Talk to Andrew, tell him what prospects in the village. And there's no problem with money here. What a farm she has. Nancy didn't know whether she was doing the right thing or not, but she had to decide something. She went to bed with a heavy heart. In the morning, she decided to go. What to do here? When the bus came and she got on, she saw Peter running to his house. Then he immediately closed his eyes again. Grandpa Nick had died. She learned about it from Sveta the girl, from their village I met by chance in town. Nancy tried not to blame herself. She understood perfectly well that Nick's grandfather would never get out. But she realized what Peter thought of her. A week later, she went to Andrew. Strange that he hadn't shown up in the meantime. His mom opened the door. Nancy hadn't seen her yet, and to be honest, she kind of scared her right off. "Hello, Andrew's home. Who are you?" "Not Nancy." "Nancy." The girl tried to smile. "You shouldn't come here anymore, Nancy." Andrew met a nice city girl. Well-mannered. She was taken aback. "What do you mean, met?" He knew I was going to the funeral. But he knew what. "Tell me what you can give to your family. You don't have a job yet. No parents to help now." Nancy even began to gasp for air at such accusations, then spoke out. "Well, yes, I guess it's nothing you dream of, is it? But only if the house I've got is worth more than your apartment or the farm, for which I got a very large sum. But you don't care about that now, do you? Goodbye." She ran downstairs. Tears rolled from her eyes. The steps merged into one. That same day, Nancy threw all her things into a suitcase and left for the village. Yes, fuck it all. People live in the village, especially with her profession. In the evening, someone knocked quietly on the door. Yes, there was Andrew. "Hello, Nancy." She threw herself on the back of a chair and looked at him with interest. God, what did she see in him? He was a skinny, long guy with glasses. Pale hands, pale forehead, sweating all the time. She's like her mom said, "You're letting out a rich bride." "Why would you do that?" "I just missed you." "I missed you." "That's good." "I said some things to your mom in there." "It's okay. My mom's not a very good character. You'll have to forgive her for not talking to her so nicely the whole time they knew each other." Nancy suddenly burst into tears. "It's a shame. Is she so ugly that you can love her for her inheritance?" "Andrew, you see, what's the matter?" Nancy looked at Andrew, who was sitting on her bed, and grinned. "You're a very good man. Do I need you that much? I inherited a lot of debt." Andrew from the villages. "What debts?" Nancy's getting a little carried away. "What kind of debts?" "Strange. That's strange." "Andrew, it's nothing. I just remembered I have to go somewhere urgently. I'll meet you tomorrow." He quickly sneezed on those slits and vanished. There's no other name for it because Andrew never stonked. In fact, he looked more like a ghost. Nancy threw herself on the bed and burst into tears at what was wrong with her. What? She'd gotten a pretty good education, so she fell asleep and thought. In the morning, I packed all my things. She got on the bus. She went out and looked around. But isn't it beautiful? At the edge of the village, construction was boiling. She heard they were building a new club. It will be called the House of Culture. You can live anywhere, and the saying, where you're born, there you are. You shouldn't forget it at all. She entered her yard and left the yard with new eyes. That's good. There's the house. I haven't seen Peter Nancy. She'd walked by their house a few times on purpose, but he either didn't see it or didn't want to come out. Probably the latter. It's all right. He'll get over it. He'll understand, and they'll make up. Nancy realized more and more every day that she wanted to be with him, wanted to live together, to have children together. 2 weeks passed. During that time, Nancy sold most of the farm, keeping some for herself, of course. She also became very good friends with Molly. They hadn't talked much before because Molly was older. Nancy didn't recognize her at first. Skinny, kind of brooding, but then she got over it. They got to talking. One night when they were having tea, Molly asked Nancy, "What do you think of the job?" "I don't know. I'll have to go to the headmaster, see what he suggests, or the nurse's station." "There's a paramedic." Molly laughed too. "What kind of paramedic is he?" "Well, you know, it's embarrassing to put a man down like that. Stop thinking about people. They're alcoholics about it." All night, Nancy thought about it. It's true, nobody thinks about her. Why should she? Especially since Molly's right not to. In the morning, she picked up her papers and headed for the office. Andrew used to be called chairman, but now he's a director. What difference does it make, really? He was the one who dealt with all matters in the village. Oh, Nancy, they told me you were back, and I thought it was for good. Or is it business? Business, Andrew. It's about the principal's job. Rubbing my hands together. So you're back for good, not running away. Yeah, it's not in the plans yet. He looked at her real hard. See, I'm gonna hire you now. You later. Come on, Andrew. I'm not 18, I said I'll be here. After an hour of negotiation, when the acting paramedic was called in and sprayed around with fumes of booze, he thanked her profusely for getting rid of such a responsibility. Nancy received the keys to the nurse's station in her hands. She stared at them in amazement, but she was a real person now. Straight from the office, she went to the nurse's station. The grass is higher than the fence. The path is narrow to the door. Yeah, the old paramedic didn't bother much. Nancy's had enough and rolled up his sleeves. Now she can do what she really needs to do. No one showed up at the nurse's station. At least 2 weeks. Dust lay everywhere. The few instruments that had been messed with piled on a table. An hour or two later, the door opened and Nancy heard Molly's voice. Nancy, are you here? Nancy looked out here. Where else would I be? Molly laughed. Oh, I can't. Have you seen yourself? Nancy wiped the streaks on her cheek, fixed her hair, which immediately jumped back into free flight. Come on, neighbor, help me out instead of laughing. It's a two-handed job. The work went faster. By evening, the insides of the medical center were shining and glistening. They walked out. Nancy sighed tiredly. I'll have to put all this beauty out tomorrow myself. Listen, ask your mother if you can plant any more flowers now. I will. We'll have to ask the men to mow. I don't want to ask anyone myself. In the morning, Nancy got up early, gave her a cow, put her out in the herd. She was immediately surrounded by the village women. Nancy, is it true you're our paramedic now? She smiled, isn't it true? And that every day you will work and even come like that. Today she put on more orders. And from tomorrow, you're welcome. Just think, just a little while ago you were a girl running around. And now you're a doctor. It's crazy. Nancy, it was nice to hear all that. She was starting to feel proud of herself. I mean, what did she need in that town? She's got everything. A big house, good money, a job. And if she works hard, she'll get a lot of respect. And then maybe Peter will hear about what she's like. And he'll come to her. Nancy realized that they were adults, that they could talk. But she knew Peter well. He wouldn't be the first to talk. On the first day that the nurse's station was to be open, Nancy, before she reached it, saw a crowd of old ladies outside. She realized perfectly well that today she would have an exam. There was no other way to call it. And of course, everyone got sick all at once. Molly, who was walking next to her, she was taking her daughter to kindergarten when she whistled. Well, friend, you can't get it all sorted out by tomorrow. Nancy smiled. It's okay, I can handle it. By lunchtime, the line had visibly settled down. Nancy could feel her stomach rumbling. Her patient heard it. When did the appointment end? She came out and said, Takshi. Our doctor's tummy's already rumbling. Give me some tea at least, girls. Everyone agreed without complaint, for which Nancy was very grateful to him. Half an hour later, she looked out into the corridor a little more rested and cheerful. Who was next for health? By evening, all the old ladies went home satisfied. The director dropped by and asked if he needed anything. Nancy, with a nice smile, handed him the list and added that it was very urgent. The principal looked perplexed at the double sheet, which had been and written off on all sides. What is all this stuff anyway? Yup, everything, nothing could be left out. He scratched the back of his head. Didn't I overreact by putting you in Peter's place? Nancy remained silent. Andrew sighed and walked out. She never saw Peter again. Then Molly told her he was working on some city job, felling timber into plots. He only comes home on Saturday to pray, sleep, and then go back to the woods. But not the same ones at his house. It's been 2 months since Nancy started work. The grandmothers were happy. That's the main thing. At that age, they don't want medicine so much as attention. Of course, there have been younger people who've come in. Nancy had 2 of them rushed to the hospital. One man with appendicitis, the other with kidney pain. I mean, Nancy couldn't be 100% sure without tests. But it looked a lot like stones. As it turns out, she wasn't wrong. The hospital said a couple more days, and there'd be no one left to treat. It was the end of a normal workday. The weather was bad outside, so there weren't many patients today. Nancy was just about to close the medicine safe when the door slammed, and someone yelled, "Doctor is doctor." Nancy jumped out of the office. "Peter," Nancy almost fainted. Peter was in such a state. "Daughter here." One of the men looked at her fearfully. "Here on the couch." Peter was put on the couch. "Somebody get Frank. If he's sober, get him over here." The younger one nodded and ran out of the infirmary. Nancy, on the other hand, examined Peter several times on the head. "Looks like the bones are intact. The wounds are superficial. His arm is hanging by a whip from his shoulder. Look, we need to avoid the city. If possible, the forest is the only place where our men can make money. If this gets out, we'll lose all our jobs. Are you crazy? A man can die." "I understand. I'm saying if it's possible." Lucky for Nancy, Frank was sober. He walked briskly into the office. He glanced at Peter. "What do we do? Let's take it one step at a time. Let's start with the head." An hour later, Nancy put in the last stitch. Frank smiled approvingly. "Good job." Peter opened his eyes. Nancy, lying quietly still. He smiled again and closed his eyes. The arm turned out to be dislocated. Frank helped. Peter screamed and finally passed out. "Nothing, just a little soreness, that's all." Peter's mother literally flew into the nurse's station. She threw herself at the man who asked not to send Peter to town, that he was satisfied. Sitting there, "You'd better fall through the ground, Gad." The man turned away from her clapping and said nothing. As Frank explained, he was the cheerleader. "Calm down, Vanessa. Like you don't know your son. He's the first to go everywhere." A woman looked in on her. "Nancy, don't worry. Everything will be fine. I'll be here with him till morning. I'll stay with you too. You don't have to. I'll be fine." Peter woke up in the middle of the night, looked around the nurse's station with a hazy gaze, stopped it on Nancy and Nancy sleeping at the table. Dropped off. "Peter, how are you feeling?" "Who knows? Not so good. You're very lucky. You only took the glancing blow to the head." "Yeah, lucky. So lucky." Peter was transported home in the morning. Vanessa, his mother, thanked Nancy for a long time. Then she said, "Nancy, you're coming." "Well, of course, I'll come back every day to change the bandages. Treat them. Then the live ones have to come off." Nancy ran to Peter's house every day. Except the easier Peter got on him, the gloomier he looked. One day he said to Nancy, "You can go no more, Peter, you don't have to." She realized he wasn't talking at all about her looking after him as a doctor, but specifically about their relationship. Tears came to her eyes. "You're sure? I'm sure of it. You said yourself you wanted to marry a city man, so I'll stay out of the way." Nancy wanted to say something, but Peter beat her to it. "Anyway, I'm getting married soon. I got a fiancé." Nancy ran out of the house like a scalded man. All the way home, she ran and cried. She calmed down a little at home. It's just Peter freaking out. Anyone would freak out if they were him. Well, he'll calm down a little, and then they'll talk. Time passed. Peter didn't make any moves. Then she found out he'd gone into the woods again. Nancy was furious. "Oh yeah, to hell with you. William's been after her for a long time. The boy from the neighboring village. She'll get Peter." A day later, William showed up with a chocolate bar. He sat in silence. Then he said tomorrow's a day off to the club. "Some artists are coming. Why don't we go?" He said he was hopelessly sure he'd be turned down. "Shall we go?" William jumped, didn't he? "I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock tomorrow." "All right then." Nancy felt absolutely nothing for William, not disgust, not sympathy. It was just the man and the man and the man. All that was on her mind was Peter. Had he really told her the truth? No way. He was just trying to annoy her. Nancy was sure of it. It was all right, Peter. She could be angry too. Of course, she knew perfectly well that it was all a kindergarten, but she couldn't help it. It wasn't nice to William. She didn't promise anything like that, though. He didn't say anything like that. He invited her to a club. She said yes. William knocked on the door. Minute to minute. Nancy wasn't quite ready yet. Yeah, come in. He went in, took a look around. It's quite a place. Even bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. Nancy laughed. That doesn't make sense. A house can't be bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. William smiled too and touched the big TV. Do you have a household too? I do. What's a village without a farm? A big one. No, a couple of piglets, a cow, and some small things. The man looked at her with admiration. How do you manage? Nancy laughed. What's a farm? Tears. We used to have a farm. You could drag your feet. You probably know that yourself. Know how. Are you sure? You're not from our village. William sighed. I am. My mom managed to give birth to me. 4 houses left. No road. So we'd sell the house and move somewhere closer. The man laughed. Who needs it in that remote area? It's almost 7 kilometers to work. Nancy sat down in front of him. But we have to do something. Go to Grigory Andreevich. William waved his hand. Went more than once. Do you know what he says to me? He says that in my family there is only one worker. It's not profitable to give a house. It's better to give a house to a family with several workers and children. Nancy shook her head. On the one hand, the director could be understood. But on the other hand, what should people do? Half an hour later, they walked towards the club. The crowd was apparently invisible. People from all the neighboring villages came to see the town's artists. She saw Peter. Her heart clenched, and Peter noticed her and immediately disappeared. Nancy turned her head for a long time, but she never saw where he had gone. It wasn't until they were already telling stories she noticed him. Peter came into the hall, holding some girl under his arm. Nancy was so cold. Wasn't he lying? He really does have a fiancée. The mood was ruined. She didn't see who was performing there, what was being sung. She just sat there staring in front of her. She clapped when other people clapped. After the concert, there was dancing. She saw Peter dancing with the same girl. There was only one thought in her head. She had to talk to him. Tell him they are both wrong. Peter pressed the girl very tightly against him, and she cried out. And then Nancy laughed, even felt sick. She grabbed William by the arm and dragged him to the dance floor. I can't dance. Nancy will learn. She clung to him and gradually moved closer to where Peter was dancing. He noticed her for a long look and then pressed his lips to that girl's lips. Nancy had nothing to do, and she immediately kissed William. The guy's eyes popped out of his forehead in surprise, and Peter was gone. How long did Nancy keep looking for him? But she never saw him again. William, I'm going home to the wall. How I think we are. That we have neither we nor we. I'm tired and sleepy. Can I at least walk you home? No, you can't. I just want to be alone. I see. Nancy realized she was being undeservedly rude to the guy, but she couldn't help it. She walked down the street. It was quiet, nice. Occasionally someone's dog would start barking, but they quickly calmed down. Nancy went to her wicket, sighed, pushed it open, and fell into someone's strong arms. What a bird. Peter, did you scare me? It's gonna happen. Peter smelled strongly of booze. Are you drunk? Go home. No way. How am I supposed to go home when you've been tailing me all night on purpose? Peter, what's wrong with you? He held her and wouldn't let go. Then he looked at her. I missed Peter. Nancy got scared. Peter, please go home. He picked her up in his arms and carried her towards Sarajevo. Peter, please don't, please, you don't have to be so loud that a respected paramedic is caught doing something indecent. You and I are about to engage in some very indecent activities. Peter. She resisted as long as she could. But Peter wasn't rude, he was just persistent. Toward morning, Peter silently got up and slipped out of the barn, but never said a word to her. Nancy had so hoped that now they would all finally talk and work things out. She could see that he cared for her. He's just made up his mind about some nonsense for some reason. But it's all right, she'll go and talk to him. And all day Nancy lay on the sofa, decided to give herself a real day off. She slept in, got up in the evening, made a salad, and collapsed in front of the TV again. The next day, almost as soon as Nancy got to work, William showed up, holding a bouquet of asters that grew in every yard, a solemn expression on his face. "Nancy, how have I missed you?" Nancy cocked an eyebrow in surprise. Then she remembered how she behaved with William, and blushed. It wasn't really his fault. She and Peter had brought him into the game. "William's not very nice, but no. But my mom's expecting us for dinner tonight. The principal has authorized the car to be taken after work." Nancy had just gathered the strength to reply as the door swung open. Standing on the doorstep was Molly. "Nancy, their Aunt Vanessa bad." Petkin and Mama went quickly. Nancy grabbed her suitcase, threw it to William. "You'll see for yourself later." They almost ran the distance to Peter's house. Molly told stories along the way. Peter was leaving in the morning, she and her mother. They had a long argument at the gate. And then Peter ducked into the car and drove off. Where did Nancy go? Where? Where to work? I don't know where, but apparently for a long time, because she had her suitcase with her. Aunt Vanessa sat on the bench with her head bowed. Mom says she thought she was crying, but she just sat there and sat there. So she ran to her, and her eyes were closed and her lips were white. Nancy Chegal was almost on autopilot. How could it be? How could he just pick up and leave? What about her? She refused to believe that Peter had run away again. Well, it can't go on like this forever. Aunt Vanessa really wasn't well. She tried to say something, but Nancy could already see that one side of her face was twisted. She gave her a shot, then another. "Molly, run to me, call an ambulance. Say stroke. Tell them I asked them to call. There's a number taped to the phone." And Molly looked frightened at Aunt Natasha and rushed to the station. There at the gate stood a confused William. "What's there, Nancy soon?" "What Nancy? A man is dying there." Molly waved her hand and rushed into the room. By the time the woman was taken away, there was a crowd outside her house. "Molly, look after mine today." "I'll go with her." "Sure, Nancy, no problem. But what about you?" "Figure it out. Andrew's here." "Go, Nancy. How's the freebie?" "Call me at home. I'll send a car to pick you up." "Thanks a lot, Andrew." Nancy stayed in town till morning. Toward morning, the woman started to feel a little better. "But you're a medical professional. You must realize it's too early to make any predictions." "Let's hope the woman is a country woman, a sturdy one." Nancy looked at her watch. She was catching the first bus to the village. That would do it. At the same time on bus 1 and 3 will come again. The first person Nancy saw as she stepped down from the foot of the bus was. It was Andrew. The last person Nancy expected to see here at all. "Nancy, I've been waiting for you for a hell of a long time." "Andrew, what are you doing here anyway? But you're missing." So I figured, wait, you're supposed to be marrying a city girl who's no match for me. He wrinkled his nose crankily. "Stop it. It doesn't suit you." The marriage didn't work out because, anyway, it doesn't matter. It's like you're not happy to see me. What should Andrew squint at? How fast have you changed? "Andrew, what does it matter if I've changed or not? You have no business being here." She wanted to walk past, but Andrew walked beside her. "Nancy, I get it. You're hurt. You're angry. All right, I agree with you. But I think we know each other well enough to overlook little things like arguments." "Andrew, you really don't get it, do you?" Nancy stopped. "You can go back to your town in peace." "Nancy, what? I think we'll at least talk. Are you giving me tea?" "No, I'm not giving you tea." "Nancy, I'm having difficulties. And I don't need support both mentally and financially." Nancy squinted angrily. "It's what they would go for you, Andrew, along with your mommy." Andrew stopped smiling too. He was just about to say something when a car stopped nearby. "Nancy, trouble." She turned around. William got out of the car. "William, it's just hooked up and it won't go away." William quickly stepped between her and Andrew. "Young man, you don't understand. You were told to go where you were going." Andrew spat. "You'll regret it," looking for shelter. Andrew turned around and walked away, and Nancy even gasped with indignation. William turned to her. "You're not a cow. You're very beautiful, Nancy. When we go to meet my mom." "Jesus, William, you too." Nancy turned and rushed toward the house. William gave her a long look. 3 days later, Nancy went to the hospital again. Aunt Kathy brought some honey and a piece of homemade cheese. "Say hello to Vanessa. Let her get well. Don't spoil herself." "Okay, Aunt Kathy, I will." Nancy pushed open the door to the room and froze at her mother's bedside as Peter sat gently spoon-feeding her. "Hello." He glanced at her briefly, nodded, and continued to feed the woman. Nancy walked over and laid out on the table everything she had brought. "So how are you guys doing here?" Aunt Vanessa smiled. It didn't come out very well, though you could tell she was smiling. "Kathy sent you a reply and said she was correcting you." More like a nod. Peter left the room. Nancy sat for a while and then scrambled out as well. She saw him at once, came over. "Thank you, Nancy, for Mom saved Grandpa wouldn't, but Mom did." "Peter, Grandpa couldn't have been saved. Believe me, you didn't try, you just left. See how you don't understand? How can I explain it to you? Even if they had taken him to the hospital, he still wouldn't have recovered. And I don't want to hear anything. Peter, Nancy, and I took 2 days off. I'm leaving again tomorrow, and I won't be back for a long time." "Peter, what's it got to do with me?" "But I love you." Peter grinned wickedly. "Well, you'll love someone else." "It's the truth. Peter is family. And I'm leaving tomorrow, and I don't care what you're telling me right now. I don't believe you, and I honestly don't want to." Peter got up and went to the hospital. "Peter, stop." He didn't turn around. She drove home, and not a single tear came out of her eyes. She got off the bus, walked to the house, and there was someone sitting on the bench at the gate. Nancy sighed. It was William, and apparently his mom. Well, apparently it was her fate that Nancy put a smile on her lips. William rushed towards her. "Nancy, you forgive us, but you never have time." Nancy held out her hand in response. "Nancy, come on in." As they walked through the yard. When they entered the house, Camille gasped. How big was this place in the city? Not everyone has one. Nancy turned with a smile, so there's not much room to swing in the city. They're small apartments. You're right. Nancy, what is there in the city if you can live as a human being in the countryside? Nancy threw off her jacket and began to set the table. She was in the mood to rip it off and throw it away. And then she remembered that one of the patients had brought her a beautiful bottle, saying that relatives had brought it from the south. She remembered how relaxing it was and quickly found it. Put it in the middle of the open table, looked at them, who were all looking at the house. Let's get to the table. Hungry everyone. The woman looked around. Oh, so many things to eat. Don't be shy. What's this? This is cognac from the south. I've never tasted cognac. For almost an hour, they talked about nothing, about the weather, about nature, about potatoes not being born. Then Camille, when apparently the cognac had done its work, spoke on the right subject. You on the walls, you realize that you are no longer young for the village and generally considered an old diva. As it happens, her William Mine was almost 30 years old. Camille banged her fist on the table. William jumped up. Mom kept her voice down. Nancy watched the woman with interest. William just didn't know where to put himself. And Camille continued, you should be alone. Especially since my William has fallen head over heels in love with you. And you're a girl with blood and milk, with a respectable job, a house and a farm. There's a lot of independent women like you nowadays. Anyway, you should get married. She said it like she was making a point. William sat there red as a crab. She poured the walls for everyone and said, well, if we must, we'll get married. Camille took a swig and immediately wanted one. She and William carried her over to the couch. Vali kept apologizing. Nancy, I'm sorry, Mommy doesn't drink at all, just pour. Just a teaspoon before bedtime. I don't know what came over her. It's okay, let her rest. You can't drive. You can't make her drive so many kilometers at night. I wasn't thinking. Varya gave her a confused look. Nancy, what did you say about getting married? That's what I said. You want to marry me, don't you? Very much. Tell me honestly, is it for the house or not? No, Nancy, it's Mom who's always looking for an advantage. That's all. So she's starting to get ready for the wedding. Nancy S. threw the dishes in the sink. I stood there, thought about it, and decided it would help in the morning. What are you standing there for? Let's go where? What do you mean? Where to sleep? Just like that. Well, you can wait till the wedding if you want. She went to her room and William, as if he'd realized it, ran after her. In fact, Nancy realized that she was doing it because of the resentment she felt toward Peter. But she said to herself, it's all right, it's all right. Or so Peter told me quickly. Soon William showed up. Of course, even with his eyes closed, it was clear that it wasn't Peter. Valley turned away and drank, and she lay staring at the ceiling. The tears quietly flowed and flowed. In the morning, Nancy got up before everyone else. She quietly changed her mind. Dishes ready, put them away when she got dressed. Camille woke up as well. Oh, Nancy, how come I slept through everything? Where are you going? To work for breakfast. How are you getting home? Well, drop my keys off at the nurse's station. Well, whether it was on purpose or just a coincidence. But Camille showed up at the nurse's station just as it was getting crowded. Camille was sick. One of the old ladies came up to meet her, but you'd say she was sick. She brought the house keys to her future daughter-in-law. What daughter-in-law? Well, to which Nancy knows. You're lying, so our Nancy can marry your William. Why should I lie? You don't believe me? And the keys to his secret Camille went to the door of the study. Opened it on the wall, took the keys. I checked everything, turned everything off. Okay, Camille, thank you. The old woman closed the door and looked at everyone in the room. What's eaten and what's interesting about it? My William is so bad, he's not fit to be Nancy's husband. The same old woman laughed. No, why not bad? Not bad only or not very bad. But neither is your whole family. And Camille Evil flashed his eyes and headed for the exit at the door and stopped. He who laughs last laughs well and left. The old ladies whispered for a long time. One of them summed it up. Well, if you are 28 to 29 years old, you will marry a goat. The old ladies nodded, but still some feeling that everything was wrong did not leave them. Almost a month passed. William visited her often, but not as often as her future mother-in-law. You could say she moved in with Nancy completely. Sometimes she could cook dinner, but more often she just relaxed and almost never did the dishes. Nancy didn't pay any attention to that. She paid no attention to anything at all because she had other things on her mind right now, not happy thoughts at all. The fact was that Nancy was pregnant. She herself had only found this out a few days ago after doing some calculations. Nancy realized that the father was definitely not William. She breathed a sigh of relief. To be honest, she didn't want children with William just yet. But she immediately grabbed her head. What was she going to do now? The wedding was in 2 weeks, a wedding to William. A baby inside her with Peter. Nancy didn't know what to do. Didn't really want to be a single mother. Sure, it wasn't exactly ancient times now, but the baby would still have a hard time. If she canceled the wedding in the hope that Peter would come and recognize her child later, she could be embarrassed. Nancy lay awake for several nights and then decided to tell William everything. She couldn't lie to him like that. He's not lazy, but he's still human. We didn't get to talk until just before the wedding. Camille kept close to them, living according to the principle that where they were, there she was. And I was always trying to teach them something. William doesn't need to talk to you. Let's talk. He came home from work and lay in front of the TV. A very serious conversation. William turned off the TV, sat on the couch. Is something wrong? Yes, Nancy sighed. You see, before you, I dated a guy. So we broke up. Then you got married, things got crazy. A few days ago, William got tense. What? That he's back? No, it's worse. I don't see how it could be worse. Worse for you. Anyway, William, I'm pregnant. Not with you. But I'm not terminating the pregnancy. Nancy blurted it all out in one breath and winced at how relieved she felt. William was silent. She opened her eyes. He sat silent, arms lowered listlessly. "What's it like now?" "I don't know, William. I've told you everything. It's up to you." She left the room and then heard the front door slam. Apparently, William had left. Nancy sighed. Well, if he decided to call off the wedding, so be it. Only something told her he wouldn't cancel anything. William came the next day. Nancy, my mom, and I talked it over. Consulted who? Nancy thought she was going to faint at that confession. Mom, of course. You didn't want to lie to her, did you? No, but I thought it was our business for now. No, it's not. I mean, she'll think it's you. But well, that it'll be her own grandchild. Nancy sighed. Maybe he was right, but it was kind of gross, like getting dirty. So what did you and Mom decide? We decided you gave us no choice. Did that sound like that again? Not really, but Nancy just didn't know what to say. Nancy, let's just not talk about it. That's all. We don't know what's ahead of us. William, what do you mean? No, it's just that life is very unpredictable. It seemed like everything had been decided, but Nancy didn't feel very good about the conversation. They decided not to have a big wedding. Camille supported them in what? And rightly so, there's no money to waste. Better to buy something. Nancy grinned. Money, considering that it was mostly Nancy who was spending money on the wedding, was funny to hear. Of course, this was not at all how Nancy had envisioned the day from the wedding. It left the impression that they were just paying tribute to tradition. Nancy went back to work and William took a vacation. He said that first of all, he was tired, and secondly, they were obliged to give time off after the wedding. Nancy was already realizing that she was not going to break her leg very much. When the pregnancy was 3 months old, Nancy began to agonize. Yes, so much that just her soul was turned inside out. Whatever she did, whatever she took, she was throwing up all the time. She had already pulled out all her textbooks, but she couldn't find anything. She knew it was common, something she didn't like. Please, I'm going into town tomorrow for 2 days. He's away from the TV. Why do you need all these tests? To get registered. Okay, sure. He went back to watching TV. Nancy sighed that she was alone before she got married and after. That you can't get yourself registered. Nancy laughed. Come on, Camille. You can't do that. You could even be punished for it. It used to be so much easier. You got pregnant, had a baby, and that was it. And now a bunch of tests for all sorts of nonsense only harm the baby. Nancy went back to her room with a smile. It was nice that at least someone cared about the baby. Of course, you can't make Valia love someone else's child. But at least sometimes you can ask about her well-being. In 2 days, the nausea was almost completely gone. Nancy didn't understand anything. The doctor spread his hands. Look for a problem at home. Maybe food. Maybe country milk. You see, we can try to find the cause of what's making you so nauseous. But we'll only know that when you've had the baby. Nancy, and I knew it all too well myself, but try to ride to the city all the time is not good either. I just decided to be patient. That time would pass, and the nausea would pass. But I still decided to diet. Not to eat anything at all. What could it be? She came home. Her mother-in-law asked her what her tests were, what was normal, what wasn't normal. Only then did she let her rest. Nancy first wanted to go to her room, but then she decided to lie down on the veranda. It's a little cooler there, plus the air is fresh. She was already starting to fall asleep. She heard William and his mother come into the kitchen. The mother was reading to William. Nancy was about to pull the pillow over her ears when she realized the conversation was about her. William, you didn't bring any wheat again. Mom didn't have time. Well, really, there's a whole wagon load of work to do. But get to work. Of course, it's more important. Did you hear that creep is back? What geezer? What Peter? The one your Nancy was having an affair with. William was quiet for a while. How do you know who she was having an affair with? You're the only one who doesn't know. Everyone else knows. So she came back. So what? Nancy's married now. Oh, but God gave her a fool of a son. You want me to tell you what could happen? Well, tell me this. Nancy could physically feel her breathing getting heavier. Peter's back. It was a nightmare, but she barely breathed. And she knew there was a reason her mother had brought William into the kitchen. Her room was very far away, which meant that what they were talking about was not for Nancy to know. And then there was the grass. What kind of weed? Nancy, maybe with honesty. She told you she wasn't pregnant by you. Any other woman would have just kept her mouth shut, and you'd be raising someone else's child. But she's gonna tell you because he's about to have a kid. Who knows how he'll behave, but it's obviously not gonna do us any good. Option 1, he'll tell Nancy that since they share a child, they should be together. The second one is he'll tell her to fuck off. Then when the baby's born, he'll start making demands. Yeah, money grubbing. See, for some reason, Mom thought she'd tell him something. And then for some reason she thought it was gonna be that bad. Because son, I've lived. I also really don't want to go back to our house. Back to your meager paycheck and the basins in the rain. I don't know where you're going with this. Am I supposed to walk next to Nancy so she doesn't, God forbid, talk to him? You don't have to walk next to her. Just get your ass up and go get some weed. If you give her a little more, she won't just be nauseous anymore. Everything should be fine. Then if we don't abort, we'll be rid of this baby in a couple or 3 weeks. And no one and nothing, son, will stop us from enjoying life. Nancy procured the edge of a pillow to keep from screaming at what she had just heard. Her mother-in-law is poisoning her baby. What should she do now? Run to the neighborhood police officer? And how will Nancy prove all this? She's got no one to stand up for her. Something told Nancy that if she went out there and told them to get lost, no one would leave. What would happen to her was not so clear. She heard a truck pull away from the house. That means William went to get weed. She's got to get to the people, and then we'll see what happens. She slipped quietly out of the porch and walked briskly toward Peter's house. She didn't understand why, though of course she realized that if anyone could protect her, it was him. But everything would have to be told. Everything absolutely. She yanked open the wicket, peeked out. No one seemed to notice her. Took a breath. Who are we hiding from? Nancy shuddered. It was a voice she would have recognized from 1,000. Peter, hello. I need to talk to you. My husband doesn't scold. And Nancy couldn't hold back any longer. At first she just cried. And then she got really hysterical. Peter was looking at her terrified. Nancy, do you have him? That he's hitting you. I'm gonna beat the hell out of him. No, he doesn't. Then what? Let's go in the house. He took Nancy under his arm and quickly led her home. Aunt Vanessa gasped, Nancy, baby, what's the matter with you? Hold on, I'll get you some water. While Nancy sang loudly, banging her teeth against the edge, Peter and his mother and watched her intently. Nancy set the glass down, calmed down a little, sighed. There's something I need to tell you. Peter sat down on the chair in front of her. Go on then. I don't think the story will be too interesting. But go ahead. Nancy missed the moment when Peter put his mask back on. I don't care. Let him act however he wants to act. It'll only help. She sighed again. I'm pregnant. Peter smirked. That's very valuable information. Nancy sighed again. Not from my husband. It's from you, isn't it? He stood up, then sat down. Nancy, why would you do that? If you weren't married. But why would you lie now? And I'm not lying. But I didn't come here to tell you about the pregnancy. Right before the wedding, I told William that I was expecting a baby and that it wasn't his. He and my mom were deciding what to do, but they decided to let it be. I calmed down, relaxed, and decided that never in your life will you ever know you're having a baby. Peter clenched his fists but remained silent. Aunt Vanessa moved closer to her and stroked her arm. Don't worry. Tell me. Nancy somehow felt calmer, and she went on talking. After Nancy had finished her story, Vanessa said that her grandmother in Nice was a pain in the ass. Apparently, he only got it from her. After all, they want to destroy a living soul. Peter didn't get up from his mom. Not just a living soul. They want to ruin my child. Nancy raised his head. Peter, I don't want anything from you. I won't ask you for anything. Just help. And I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm just afraid to go home. But we'll talk about what happens next later. Right now, we have other things to think about. This is a very delicate situation. As you can imagine, it's no big deal, especially since the tests didn't show anything. There's no way to prove it. What's most important now? Vanessa's up. The most important thing is not to jeopardize the lives of the baby and Nancy. We need to save all these proceedings for later. That's also true. But we can't let them go unpunished either. You realize what they're doing is a real crime. I do realize that, but I'm not letting Nancy go in there. Mom, wait. Would you call James? Vanessa blushed. James had only recently come to their village. He had been in the militia, and when he retired, he had bought a house and left the city apartment to his son, who, by the way, also continued his work. Vanessa and James began a friendship and then a romance. They kept it a secret. James didn't understand why, though. Why do I have to go call him? Go get him. He's your neighbor, too. Mom, please go. He'll understand you quicker. Vanessa, I wanted to say something else, but I changed my mind and ran out the door. Peter moved closer to Nancy, took her lessons in his. Nancy, you hear me? Don't be afraid. Nobody's gonna hurt your baby. Nancy, even though I was very upset, I noted that Peter said yours, not ours. So be it. She doesn't care. The important thing is that no one threatens her baby. Nancy was sure she was going to have a daughter. 15 minutes later, Vanessa returned. She was accompanied by a distinguished-looking man. The girl had to tell the story again. There you go. I thought this couldn't happen in the village, so it's for the house, for the money. That's what they can do. The way I see it, it's not really about the baby. It's the house that's at stake. These guys are all over it. Is that what it is? Grass, you say. It's really not that hard to find out what she's getting. It's just that you need credentials. You sit here, I'll go get my son. Peter's up too. But how? We don't know anything from what Nancy says. James smiled. A good bloodhound. Everything will find weed, and it will leave its mark either in the car or at home or in that old house. He turned to Nancy. You better lie down, run, or better yet, sleep. All this won't be soon. And you need to rest. And don't go outside, all of you. God forbid they suspect anything and that's it. We'll never find anything. Nancy lay down on Peter's bed with pleasure. Everything here in the room smelled, and they were so pleasantly exciting. Peter peeked in on her a couple times, but Nancy was sweetly asleep. It was as if she had stopped worrying. Realized that she was treated very differently in this house. It was voices that woke her up, and then a light flashed in the room. Peter stood on the threshold and smiled. Well, you get up to bed. You need to testify. They've already taken your relatives. Nancy sat up abruptly. How? Just like that. William came home. Mother's waiting. She says you're missing. So they went looking for you. They've got the whole place surrounded. They forgot all about what they left in the car. James says that wood only looks safe, but in the right hands it could be poison. Nancy, just bear with me. Answer all the questions. Okay, Peter. Is there anything else to eat? I'm eating out of my mind right now. I haven't eaten since this morning. He looked at her, then he laughed. Well, sure, we'll feed you. You have. 15 minutes later, Nancy was gnawing on a large tea sandwich and answering questions. She had so far refused to eat more serious food just so as not to embarrass the uniformed people, but she was already imagining how she would return the plate of soup that Vanessa was now sorting out. She went over everything one more time, answered a few questions, and the policeman left. After a hearty dinner, she felt sleepy again. I should probably go home. Now that I'm not nauseous, I'm hungry all the time, eating and sleeping. Vanessa laughed. That's normal, kiddo. You eat and sleep with us tonight. You can go home tomorrow. Peter nodded. You know, I'd love to crash on his bed again. Let her sleep wherever she wants. If there's nowhere else, she can move just to sleep without disturbing him. Peter did come to her, lay down in his clothes, put his arms around her, and they fell asleep. How good it felt in his arms. She couldn't even think. How because she just fell asleep. Woke up in the morning, he was gone. She goes into the room. There's a distraught Vanessa sitting at the table. Where did Peter go? He's gone like a tumbleweed again, honestly. He left like that, but he left a note like that. He wrote it. I need to find out about myself, whether he's so attracted to his job, romance, and all that, or he's just a born fool. Nancy sank helplessly into a chair. She decided the night before that everything was going to be different. Peter again. The girl stood up. I'm going to go, Aunt Vanessa. I have to go to work soon. Are you feeling all right? Nancy smiled very well, didn't she? Here, take this with you to work. I baked buns and cutlets. Oh, you don't have to, I do. And remember, if my son is a fool. Do you have it? I got it, and I'm not leaving you. Nancy smiled sadly and walked out of the house. Vanessa escorted her out with a look. God, poor girl, she had been through so much. The time passed very quickly. Nancy had only been called to the police once, and then Vanessa and James had gone to court with her. In general, lately she had the impression that she had new parents, that Vanessa and her James were just a kite over her and fed her, constantly tried to see her off and invite her to visit. Nancy didn't resist. She was very much pleased. She had not heard from Peter, and she had given up waiting. She had enough to do. At the trial she felt sick when William and his mother began to yell at each other in public, and at her too. The girl's eyes went blurry. It was a long time ago. The trial ended without her. She called an ambulance in advance. As soon as the very first contractions began, I knew that as long as they would get there, and also the first labor. They brought her to a room with 2 other women. There was still time, and even though the environment and stomach pains were not conducive to conversation, they got to know each other. One woman came for her 3rd child and the other, like Nancy, for her 1st. The labor had gone well. An exhausted Nancy threw herself on the couch. The doctor said, "No, look, you're all from the same room. All the girls here still have a princess." Nancy smiled. She fell into a dream. Thought her princess would be the princess herself. The first one to be discharged was the one who was having her 3rd child. But girls, happily, I've had enough, and I wish you at least one more visit. Nancy laughed. Oh, let's get away from this rosebud for a while. Vanessa called at the maternity hospital. Every day she had come twice already. She was so excited that Nancy almost cried. Well, my princess, home tomorrow. The baby wrinkled her nose and Nancy laughed. Vanessa and James will be coming to pick her up tomorrow. The weather in the morning was as if it had heard that the happy mommy was being discharged from the maternity hospital. It had been pouring rain for 10 days at least. It's sunny this morning. Look at the weather. She was packing. Nancy came to pick you up. She smiled, turned to her neighbor. That's it. Bye. Have a nice day. You hugged her, and you too. Your Peter will definitely come to his senses. Yesterday before they were discharged, lying in the dark, they had a heart-to-heart. Nancy told her roommate's story. It turns out that her man, as soon as he found out about the pregnancy, fled in an unknown direction. How are you? Oh, Nancy, I'm fine. Mom and Dad turned out to be the best. They won't leave me. I used to hurt them so much before. The nurse took the baby away and Nancy gave her neighbor another big hug and kiss. Be sure to come and visit me. The baby needs fresh air. I have a huge house, so take your parents too. She followed the nurse to the exit. It wouldn't be long before she was finally home. The doors opened and Nancy froze. Standing right in front of her was Peter. He was in a suit. She had never seen him in such parade before, so she hardly recognized the nurse, carried her daughter out, and Peter rushed to her. She asked sternly, "You, Daddy?" He nodded in confusion. "I'm a nurse," she smiled broadly. "But you take your beauty." Peter gingerly took the pouch, peeked inside and looked at Nancy. She's so tiny. Nancy, I wanted to kill him. The mood was gone. What are you doing here? What's what? I'm picking you and your daughter up from the hospital. You didn't have to. We did fine on our own. In case you need to leave in a hurry, like you always do. Nancy looked at him angry and Peter looked at her confused. Nancy, I'm sorry, I'm not going anywhere. I don't believe you. She took her daughter from his arms and went down the stairs. Peter stood there for a while. Then he rushed after her. He overtook her, stopped. Nancy, forgive me, you fool. Marry me. Nancy stopped. Did she feel like screaming? Yes, I do. But she restrained herself. I'll think about it. James and Vanessa hurried from the car to them. Nancy, Vanessa's daughter, hugged her, and Nancy burst into tears. Daughter, how long had it been since she had heard someone call her that? They all got into the car, Peter behind the wheel. When the car started, Nancy noticed how carefully he drove around all the pockles, how he drove as if he were carrying crystal. She smiled a little, and Vanessa leaned over to her ear and whispered right to Nancy, "And even though that knucklehead is my only and favorite son, you need to let him know how wrong he is," and sat down again as straight as anything. Nancy laughed softly. It seemed she had been very lucky to have a mother-in-law this time. One could only dream of such a one. This time the wedding was exactly what Nancy had always dreamed of: a lavish dress, a sea of guests that filled her big house, gifts, wine, and shouts of bitter. She agreed to marry Peter. After 3 months, he gave the whole one eyes and noses left. Every day after work he went to her, bought up in the store all the toys that were there. Nancy only grabbed his head. When he came joyful with a big coloring book, he showed it to Helen and said, "Oh, you'll grow up a little, and you and I will draw here." Peter, this and the books will still be lying around for at least 3 years. He looked at her perplexed. Well, at least we'll already have it, and we'll buy another one later. She then sighed, "Well, what am I going to do with you? You'll buy a house full." "Nonsense. I'll have to look after you." "Nancy, is it?" "Yes." He picked her up in his arms, spun her around, shouted something, then set her down and said, "You'll be the happiest woman ever. I promise you that."